Hey guys, tonight we begin with something darker than your morning commute, and colder than the email you got from HR last Tuesday. Industrial Manchester in the 1800s. We're talking about factory workers. Real people, not the romanticised versions from costume dramas, who survived winters so brutal they make your broken office heater look like a tropical vacation. These folks worked 14-hour shifts in buildings designed by architects who apparently believed walls were optional, slept in rooms that made your college dorm look like the Ritz, and somehow didn't all freeze to death despite the universe's best efforts. So before you get comfortable in your temperature-controlled bedroom, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, probably also avoiding sleep. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. But first, let's think about this. Have you ever wondered what it was like to work in a factory before labour laws existed? How did people stay warm when their workplace was literally colder inside than outside? What did you do when your fingers were too frozen to operate dangerous machinery, but your boss didn't care? How did families sleep when 7 people shared a bed in a room with no heat, and walls thin enough to hear the neighbour's tuberculosis cough? Could you survive on a diet that made prison food look gourmet? Would you last a week in a world where workplace safety meant try not to die today? And most importantly, how did anyone manage to not just survive these conditions, but actually live, laugh, love, and occasionally have enough energy left over to complain about it? Congratulations. You've just woken up in Manchester, 1842. The year is smack in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, which sounds exciting until you realise it mostly means revolution against your personal comfort, health, and will to live. You're a factory worker now. Your bed is a pile of rags you share with your siblings, your breakfast is whatever didn't spoil overnight, and your commute involves walking through streets that smell like a crime scene mixed with a sewage plant. The good news? You're alive. The bad news? Everything else. Welcome to the coldest nights in industrial Manchester, where survival was an Olympic sport and nobody was handing out medals. Let's start with where you spend most of your waking hours. The factory. And when I say factory, I don't mean a modern, well-lit facility with safety regulations and break rooms. I mean a massive brick prison where the primary architectural philosophy was pack in as many humans as possible and pray the building doesn't collapse. These structures were built for profit, not comfort, which meant windows were tiny, ventilation was a joke, and heating was considered a luxury reserved for the factory owner's summer home. You walk through the factory door each morning and immediately the noise hits you like a physical force. It's not just loud, it's a constant, bone-rattling roar of machinery that drowns out human speech entirely. Hundreds of looms, spinning frames, and mechanical contraptions all screaming at once, creating a wall of sound that makes your ears ring for hours after your shift ends. Want to have a conversation with your co-worker? Forget it. You'll be doing a lot of pointing and hoping they understand your increasingly desperate hand gestures. The windows, those precious sources of natural light and fresh air, are deliberately small and placed high up on the walls. Factory owners learned that big windows meant workers could see outside and remember that a world beyond cotton dust and machinery existed. Can't have that. So instead, you get these tiny, grimy rectangles that let in just enough light to see what you're doing, but not enough to improve your mood. It's like working in a very loud, very dangerous cave, a cave that occasionally catches fire. And speaking of fire, let's talk about heating, or rather, the complete absence of it. The factory owners reasoned that with hundreds of bodies packed into one space, and dozens of steam-powered machines running constantly, the building would naturally warm itself. They were partially right. In summer, the factory was an actual hellscape where workers regularly fainted from heat exhaustion. But in winter, the machines provided some warmth, sure, but it was concentrated near the equipment. Stand 3 feet away from a loom, and you might as well be outside. The cold seeped through those brick walls like they were made of paper. The floor beneath your feet is wooden, worn smooth by decades of shuffling workers, and in winter it conducts cold like a champion. Your feet, wrapped in whatever thin boots or shoes you could afford, go numb within the first hour of your shift. By hour 3, you've lost all sensation below the ankle. By hour 10, you're genuinely unsure if your toes are still attached to your body. You'll find out tonight when you try to remove your boots and discover they've frozen to your feet. Surprise! The ceiling tower's high above you, which sounds nice until you realise that all the heat rises up there and just hangs out, having a party, while you freeze at ground level. In winter, you can actually see your breath throughout your entire shift. Imagine that. Working with delicate machinery while exhaling clouds of fog, your hands so cold they can barely grip the tools, but being expected to maintain the same productivity as always. It's like being asked to perform surgery while wearing oven mitts and standing in a freezer. Ventilation was supposedly addressed by a few strategically placed vents and the occasional cracked window. But here's the thing. Nobody wanted to open windows in winter because that would let in more cold air. So instead, you breathed recycled air thick with cotton dust, coal smoke from the steam engines, and whatever diseases your 300 closest friends were currently incubating. The air was so thick with particulates that newcomers to the factory would cough for weeks until their lungs just gave up and accepted their new fuzzy coating. It's like working inside a snow globe, except the snow is textile fibres and breathing, it gives you lung disease. The layout of the factory floor was designed with maximum efficiency in mind, which meant rows and rows of machinery packed so tightly together that you could barely squeeze between them. This created wonderful opportunities for workplace injuries and also ensured that any warmth generated by the machines couldn't actually circulate. It just sat there in stagnant pockets while you shivered in the aisles. Modern fire marshals would take one look at this setup and immediately have a breakdown. You couldn't evacuate this building quickly if you tried. Good thing nothing ever goes wrong in textile factories. Oh wait, the walls were bare brick, because why waste money on plaster or paint when you could spend it on literally anything else? Bare brick is fantastic at several things: conducting cold, collecting moisture, and creating the general ambience of a Victorian prison. In winter, frost would actually form on the interior walls near the drafty windows. Inside the building. Let that sink in. You're working indoors and there's frost on the walls. It's like the building itself is telling you that hope is dead. The lack of insulation meant that every gust of wind outside became a personal attack inside. The building would creak and groan like a ship at sea, and those thin walls did absolutely nothing to stop the cold from penetrating. It's the architectural equivalent of putting up a "no cold allowed" sign and hoping that does the trick. Spoiler alert, it didn't. Lighting was another adventure. In winter, when you arrived before dawn and left after sunset, you worked entirely by artificial light. And by artificial light, I mean dim. Flickering gas lamps that cast dancing shadows and provided just barely enough illumination to see what you were doing. Perfect for operating dangerous machinery at high speeds while exhausted and freezing. What could possibly go wrong? The gas lamps also had this charming habit of making the air even stuffier and occasionally exploding, but at least they provided a tiny bit of warmth if you stood directly underneath them. Unfortunately, about 200 other workers had the same idea. The factory had multiple floors, all connected by narrow staircases that became death traps when hundreds of people tried to use them simultaneously during shift changes. The upper floors were somehow both colder and hotter than the lower ones, depending on the season, creating a microclimate of misery that varied by altitude. Ground floor workers envied the upper floor workers' proximity to the heat-hoarding ceiling. Upper floor workers envied the ground floor workers' ability to escape quickly when something inevitably went wrong. And throughout it all, the noise never stopped. That constant thundering roar of industry that made your head pound and your thoughts scatter. You couldn't hear warnings, couldn't hear cries for help, couldn't hear your own common sense screaming at you to run. The factory was designed to extract maximum productivity from human bodies while providing minimum comfort or safety. It was a machine that ate people, and you were expected to be grateful for the opportunity to be consumed. Welcome to work. Try not to freeze, overheat, suffocate, or die. At least not until your shift is over. If the building itself didn't get you, the machinery would happily volunteer. Victorian-era factory equipment was essentially a collection of metal teeth, spinning wheels and exposed gears, all moving at speeds that would make modern safety inspectors weep into their clipboards. These machines were loud, unforgiving, and had absolutely no interest in whether you'd had your morning tea before you started operating them. The power looms, spinning mules, and carding engines that filled Manchester's textile factories were technological marvels that also happened to be death traps. They had no safety guards, no emergency shut-off buttons, no "are you sure" confirmation screens. Just raw, exposed mechanical violence operating at full speed all the time. It's like if someone took every dangerous kitchen appliance you own, removed all the safety features, made them 10 times larger, and then told you to operate 6 of them simultaneously while half asleep and freezing. Let's talk about the power transmission system, which was essentially a nightmare made of leather and physics. One massive steam engine powered the entire factory through a complex system of belts, pulleys, and spinning shafts that ran along the ceiling and down through the floors. These leather belts were constantly moving, constantly under tension, and positioned at exactly head height. Lean the wrong way while reaching for something, and you'd get grabbed by a belt moving at high speed and become intimately familiar with the ceiling. The belts would snap occasionally, whipping through the air like leather lightning bolts, slicing through anything unlucky enough to be in their path. The spinning frames were particularly friendly machines. They had hundreds of spindles all rotating at terrifying speeds, and your job was to reach into this forest of spinning metal to tie broken threads. With your hands, while everything is moving, in the dark, while you're exhausted. It's like playing Operation, except the buzzer is replaced with permanent disfigurement, and the patient is actively trying to remove your fingers. Workers developed this peculiar hunched posture from years of ducking and weaving around moving parts, like they were permanently dodging punches from an invisible boxer. The carding engines, which prepared raw cotton for spinning, had massive cylinders covered in tiny metal teeth, all rotating in opposite directions. They were designed to rip apart cotton fibres, but they weren't picky. They'd happily rip apart whatever you accidentally fed them, including your hair, clothing or appendages. Women workers had to keep their hair tied back tightly, because loose hair plus rotating machinery equals a very bad day. And by bad day, I mean scalping. It happened regularly enough that it barely made the local news anymore. In winter, the machinery situation became exponentially worse. Your numb fingers couldn't grip things properly, but the machines kept demanding the same level of dexterity and speed. Drop something. Too bad. It's gone forever into the mechanical depths, and if you're lucky, that's all you lose. Your reaction time slowed down when you were cold, but the machines didn't care about your comfort level. They spun at the same relentless pace whether your hands could feel what they were doing or not. It's like trying to defuse a bomb while wearing mittens. Possible? Maybe. Advisable? Absolutely not. The machines required constant attention and adjustment. Threads broke, parts needed oiling, problems needed fixing, all while the equipment was still running because shutting down machinery meant lost productivity, and lost productivity meant lost profits. So you learned to make repairs on moving equipment, reaching into the mechanical chaos, hoping your timing was perfect and your luck was good. Spoiler, luck ran out eventually for everyone. The question wasn't if you'd have an accident, but when, and how bad it would be. The noise these machines generated wasn't just loud, it was physically painful. Imagine standing next to a jet engine, except the jet engine is made of metal parts that occasionally scrape together, creating sounds that make your teeth hurt. Now imagine doing that for 14 hours straight. Workers developed their own form of sign language because verbal communication was impossible. You couldn't hear someone screaming in warning from 3 feet away. You definitely couldn't hear your own thoughts, which was probably a blessing given what you were being subjected to. The vibration from all this machinery created a constant tremor that travelled through the floor, up your legs, and into your spine. After a few years of factory work, your hands would shake permanently, even when you weren't touching anything. It's like having internal vibrate mode enabled at all times. Trying to eat soup after a shift was an adventure in fluid dynamics. Trying to write a letter was nearly impossible. Your body basically became a tuning fork for industrial progress. Let's talk about maintenance, or rather, the complete lack thereof. Machines were run until they literally fell apart because maintenance cost money and stopping production cost money. So equipment would develop wobbles, strange grinding sounds, and concerning metal fatigue, but it kept running. You learned to read the mood of your particular machine like it was a temperamental pet. That new clicking sound? Probably fine. That smell of burning? Normal. That piece of metal that just flew off and embedded itself in the wall. Tuesday. The oiling system was another source of constant danger. Machines needed regular lubrication, which meant workers carried oil cans and had to apply oil to moving parts while the machines were running. In winter, the oil thickened, making it harder to apply, meaning you had to get even closer to the moving parts. It was like trying to moisturize an alligator. An alligator made of metal, an alligator that wanted you dead. Steam engines powered everything, which meant the factory was filled with high-pressure steam pipes that occasionally decided to explode or develop leaks. Getting hit with a jet of superheated steam would cook you from the inside out, but at least you'd be warm for the first time all day. Silver lining? The pipes also dripped condensation constantly, creating puddles on the floor that would freeze in winter, turning the workspace into an ice rink dotted with deadly machinery. It's like someone designed an obstacle course and then made it actively hostile. The machines had no ergonomics whatsoever. They were built for efficiency, not for human comfort. You stood in awkward positions for hours, reaching at unnatural angles, straining muscles you didn't know existed. In winter, when your body was already tense from cold, these positions became torture. Your back ached, your shoulders burned, your neck felt like it was made of concrete, but you couldn't slow down. The machine set the pace, and you followed or you got replaced. And here's the truly terrifying part. You got used to it. After weeks of working around these mechanical monsters, you developed a false sense of security. You got comfortable, even confident. That's when the machine would remind you who was really in charge. A moment of distraction, a second of inattention, and you'd lose a finger, a hand, or worse. The machinery was patient, and it never forgot that you were made of soft, breakable meat while it was made of hard, unforgiving metal. Every machine in the factory was basically a workplace accident waiting to happen, and they all got their turn eventually. Welcome to Victorian industry, where the machines are angry, and your life insurance policy is try not to die. Factory shifts in industrial Manchester weren't the neat 8-hour blocks we know today. They were brutal, soul-crushing marathons that started before dawn and ended long after sunset. We're talking 14, 16, sometimes 18-hour days where the concept of overtime pay was about as real as unicorns, and taking a sick day meant potentially losing your job and starving. Your day begins at 5 a.m. Actually, scratch that. Your day begins at 4:30 a.m. because you need to wake up, get dressed in the dark, possibly eat something, and walk to the factory in time to be at your station when the machines start at 6 a.m. sharp. Late? That's a fine, deducted from your already pathetic wages. Very late. That's termination. Don't bother showing up tomorrow, we've already given your spot to someone more desperate. The modern concept of grace periods or understanding bosses hasn't been invented yet. Or rather, it's been deliberately uninvented because compassion cuts into profit margins. The factory bell rings at 6 a.m. and the machines roar to life with all the subtlety of an avalanche. For the next 6 hours you stand at your station, operating machinery, fixing broken threads, avoiding injury, and trying not to think about how you're already exhausted and the day has barely started. There's no easing into it, no warming up period. It's 0 to full productivity in 30 seconds, like going from sleep to sprinting a marathon. Your body hasn't fully woken up yet, but your hands are already moving at dangerous speeds around dangerous equipment. What could go wrong? Around noon, you get your lunch break. And when I say break, I mean you get 30 minutes if you're lucky, 15 if you're not. This is barely enough time to find your lunch, choke it down, use the nightmare toilet, and return to your station before the machines start up again. There's no leisurely dining, no chance to actually digest your food properly. You're essentially refueling like a race car during a pit stop, except the food is cold, unappetizing, and your pit crew is just you, alone, exhausted, and wondering if this is what the rest of your life looks like. Some workers don't even leave their stations for lunch. They eat while standing, one hand on their food, one eye on the machine. Because leaving means someone else might take your spot or the foreman might decide you're not dedicated enough. It's workplace Stockholm Syndrome before the term existed. You develop this weird loyalty to your machine because it's the only consistent thing in your life, even though it's also the thing most likely to maim you. After lunch, the afternoon shift begins, and this is where time starts playing cruel tricks on your mind. The first hour after lunch crawls by like a wounded snail. Your body's trying to digest food while standing, while cold, while operating machinery, and it's not happy about any of it. Every minute feels like 10. You swear the factory clock has stopped, but no, it's still ticking, mocking you with its steady and different rhythm. You have 8 more hours to go. 8 more hours. Around 3 p.m., your body hits a wall, your feet ache, your back screams, your hands are starting to cramp from the repetitive motions. But there's no sitting down, no stretching, no chiropractor waiting to crack your spine back into alignment. You just push through because everyone around you is pushing through, and stopping isn't an option unless you want to join the ranks of the unemployed and starving. It's amazing what the human body can endure when the alternative is homelessness. By 6 p.m., you've been working for 12 hours. In a normal world, this would be the end of your shift. You'd go home, rest, recover. But this isn't a normal world. It's industrial Manchester, where the factory owners have done the math and determined that running the machines for longer hours is more profitable than giving you rest. So you keep going. Your second win died around hour 10. Your third win never showed up. You're running on fumes, fear, and the dim hope that someday, somehow, this might get better. The evening hours are the most dangerous. This is when accidents spike because everyone is exhausted, attention spans are shot, and reflexes are dulled. The machines don't care that you're tired. They keep spinning at the same deadly speeds, and now you're operating them with the coordination of someone who's been awake for 20 hours. It's like drunk driving, except you're sober, and the car is made of exposed gears that want to eat your fingers. In winter, these long shifts become especially brutal. You arrive in darkness and leave in darkness. Some workers go weeks without seeing actual daylight. Your entire existence becomes the factory. It's artificial gaslighting, it's constant noise, it's freezing air, it's relentless demands. You start to forget what the sun looks like. You forget what it feels like to be warm. You forget that there's a world outside these brick walls where people have things called leisure time and hobbies. Around 8 p.m. you're moving on pure automation. Your conscious mind has checked out. You're a zombie operating machinery, going through the motions because your muscle memory has taken over and your brain has given up. This is actually the safest you've been all day because you're no longer thinking, just doing. Thinking requires energy you don't have. At this point, you're basically a biological machine operating a metal machine, and somewhere a factory owner is very pleased with this efficiency. The worst part? There's no countdown clock. You don't know exactly when your shift will end. Officially it's 8 p.m, but if there's a rush order, or if the foreman is in a bad mood, or if the factory owner decides he needs more productivity, shifts can extend indefinitely. It's not uncommon to work until 9 or 10 p.m, or even midnight during peak seasons. And you can't complain because complaining marks you as a troublemaker, and troublemakers don't keep their jobs long. Some factories implemented a 2-shift system to keep the machines running 24 hours. The day shift worked 6 a.m. to 8 p.m, then the night shift took over from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. Both shifts were equally miserable, just in different ways. Day shift workers never saw their families awake. Night shift workers destroyed their circadian rhythms and worked in even dimmer lighting, increasing the risk of accidents. It was like choosing between 2 different flavors of suffering. Children worked the same shifts as adults. Let that sink in. 7-year-olds standing at machines for 14 hours straight. Their small bodies not yet developed enough to handle such strain, but cheap enough that factory owners couldn't resist exploiting them. By the time these children reached adulthood, their bodies were already broken, bent, and worn out. They'd aged 30 years in 10, all to produce textiles for people who would never know their names or their suffering. When the shift finally ends, usually around 8 p.m, you don't feel relief, you feel numb. You've transcended exhaustion and entered a zen-like state of barely functioning. You shuffle out of the factory with hundreds of other exhausted workers, all of you moving like zombies, too tired to talk, too tired to think. You have maybe 3 hours before you need to sleep so you can wake up and do it all again tomorrow, and tomorrow you will do it again. And the day after that, and the day after that. 6 days a week, sometimes 7 during busy seasons. 52 weeks a year, no vacation, no sick days, no mental health days. Just work, sleep, until your body gives out or you die, whichever comes first. Time isn't measured in hours or days anymore. It's measured in shifts survived, in weeks until payday, in years until your body breaks down completely. Welcome to industrial time management, where every hour belongs to someone else, and you're just borrowing your own life until it's time to give it back. After working yourself into an early grave for 14 hours, you'd receive wages that can only be described as insulting. Factory owners had perfected the art of paying workers just enough to keep them alive and desperate, but not enough to ever climb out of poverty. It was like a subscription service to suffering, and you couldn't cancel. Let's talk numbers. An adult male factory worker in 1840s Manchester might earn anywhere from 10 to 15 shillings per week. That sounds like money, until you realise that a basic room in a lodging house cost about 3 shillings per week. Food cost another 5 to 7 shillings, and suddenly you're doing mental math that doesn't add up to anything resembling a comfortable existence. It's like when you check your bank account after payday and realise that rent, groceries, and bills have already claimed everything before you even had a chance to pretend you were financially stable. Women? Women earned significantly less for doing the same work, about 5 to 7 shillings per week, because apparently having 2 X chromosomes meant your labour was worth half as much. The factory owners justified this by claiming women were supplementary earners, supporting a male breadwinner's income, conveniently ignoring all the widows, single mothers and women supporting their entire families on these poverty wages. It was economic discrimination with a smile and a condescending pat on the head. Children earned even less, sometimes as little as 2 to 3 shillings per week. They worked the same brutal hours as adults, operated the same dangerous machinery, faced the same risks, but got paid in pocket change. It's like doing a full-time job and getting paid in gift cards to a store that doesn't exist. Factory owners loved child labour not just because small hands were useful, but because exploiting children was even more profitable than exploiting adults. Why pay a grown man 15 shillings when you could pay a 10-year-old 3 shillings to do almost the same work? But wait, it gets worse. Those wages I mentioned, those were before deductions. Factory owners had created an elaborate system of fines that could reduce your pay to almost nothing. Late to work? Fine. Talking during your shift? Fine. Your machine broke down? Fine. Because clearly it's your fault the equipment is falling apart from overuse and neglect. Took too long in the toilet? Believe it or not, also a fine. The list of fineable offences was longer than a CVS receipt and twice as depressing. Some factories paid in tokens instead of actual money, tokens that could only be spent at the factory owner's shop where prices were mysteriously higher than everywhere else. It was an early version of a captive market economy, except instead of airport prices it was, "We own your entire existence" prices. Need bread? That'll be twice what it costs down the street, but you can't go down the street because your wages aren't in real money. It's economic imprisonment with extra steps. Payment wasn't even weekly in some factories. Some owners paid monthly or even less frequently, which meant you had to somehow survive for weeks on credit, loans from equally poor neighbours, or by skipping meals. It's like if your employer said, "We'll pay you eventually." Probably, maybe. And you just had to trust that they weren't lying. Spoiler, they were often lying, or at least conveniently forgetting, until workers threatened to riot. The truck system, as it was called, was particularly cruel. Factory owners would advance you credit to buy necessities from their company store, then deduct those debts from your wages. Sounds reasonable until you realise the prices were inflated, the interest rates were predatory, and you could work for months and still owe the company money. You weren't earning wages, you were accumulating debt disguised as employment. It's the 19th century version of "you owe your soul to the company store," except it wasn't just a song, it was your actual life. Let's put these wages in perspective. A loaf of bread cost about 4 pence, a pound of butter was around 10 pence, cheap tea, the kind that was mostly dust and regret, was about 3 shillings per pound. Coal for heating, assuming you could afford heat, was roughly 15 pence per hundredweight. Do the math, and you realise that after paying for your lodging and basic food, you had maybe a shilling or two left for everything else. Clothing, medicine, soap, the occasional luxury like not freezing to death. Saving money was a fantasy. You couldn't save because there was nothing left to save. The system was designed to keep you trapped in a cycle of working, spending everything on survival, and then working more. Social mobility. That was for people who weren't born into the working class. You stayed in your lane, worked until you died, and hoped your children might somehow have it slightly better, which they wouldn't. Families pooled their income just to survive. Father working 14 hours? Mother working 14 hours? Children working 14 hours? Combine all those wages and you might be able to afford a 2-room apartment and food that didn't make you sick. This wasn't living, it was barely surviving, and any unexpected expense, illness, accident, pregnancy, could push you from poverty into absolute destitution. The wage gap between factory workers and factory owners was obscene. While you earned 10 shillings per week, the factory owner was pulling in thousands of pounds per year from your labour. They lived in country estates with servants, ate imported foods, wore clothing that cost more than you'd earn in a lifetime, all built on the backs of workers who couldn't afford to heat their rooms in winter. It wasn't just inequality, it was a system specifically designed to extract maximum profit from human misery. Unions were forming during this period, but joining one was risky. Factory owners hated unions with a passion usually reserved for deadly diseases, and being identified as a union member could get you blacklisted from every factory in Manchester. No work meant no money, which meant starvation, which meant you'd probably reconsider your revolutionary aspirations. It was economic terrorism dressed up as free market capitalism. Some workers tried to supplement their income with side work, sewing, shoe repair, street vending, but after 14 hours in the factory you barely had energy to walk home, let alone operate a second job. And factory owners were increasingly demanding that workers sign contracts promising not to work elsewhere, ensuring they remained entirely dependent on factory wages. It's like having a second job, except your first job owns all your time and energy, so the second job is just a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. The cruelest part. Factory owners genuinely believed they were being generous. They'd give speeches about how they were providing employment, lifting people out of rural poverty, offering opportunities. Meanwhile, those opportunities involved working yourself to death for wages that couldn't support a family, in conditions that would kill you by 40. It was gaslighting on an industrial scale, convincing workers they should be grateful for the privilege of being exploited, and you couldn't just quit and find better work. Unemployment was high, competition for jobs was fierce, and factory owners colluded to keep wages low across the industry. It was a race to the bottom, and everyone was winning except the workers. If you complained about wages, you'd be replaced by someone more desperate. There was always someone more desperate. That was the genius of the system. Maintaining a surplus of desperate people ensured workers would accept any wage, any condition, any abuse, because the alternative was starvation. Payday, when it finally came, was both relief and disappointment. You'd line up to receive your wages, count the coins, realise it was somehow less than you expected, thanks fines, and immediately start doing the math on how to make it stretch until next payday. It was a weekly exercise in financial depression. The money would disappear almost immediately, landlord, grocer, coal merchant, and you'd be left with maybe a few pence for yourself. Treat yourself to a beer. Now you can't afford soap. Buy soap. Now you're eating less. It was a constant calculation of which necessity you could sacrifice this week, and the factory owners, they slept soundly in their warm beds, convinced they were pillars of the community, job creators, captains of industry. They never saw the workers shivering in unheated rooms, children going to bed hungry, families choosing between medicine and food. They just saw numbers on a ledger, labour costs, profit margins, dividends. You weren't a person with dreams and needs and a right to dignity. You were an expense to be minimised and a resource to be exploited until you broke. Welcome to wage labour in industrial Manchester, where your life is worth exactly 10 shillings per week, minus fines. When your shift finally ended, you didn't go home to a cosy apartment with central heating. You went to a lodging house, which was basically a building where the landlord had calculated the exact minimum space a human could occupy without immediately dying, and then divided that by 3. These places made modern hostels look like 5-star resorts. Picture this. You drag yourself through the smoggy streets after 14 hours of machinery and exhaustion, and you arrive at a narrow, decrepit building that leans slightly to one side like it's already given up on structural integrity. The exterior is blackened with soot, the windows are cracked or covered with rags, and the front door hangs at an angle that suggests hinges are optional. This is home. Or rather, this is the place where you sleep between shifts, which isn't quite the same thing as home, but it's what you can afford, so here we are. The smell hits you first. It's a concentrated essence of unwashed human bodies, stale urine, mould, boiled cabbage, and something that died behind a wall 3 months ago. Every lodging house has this smell. It's like a signature cologne called Desperation No. 5. You'd think you'd get used to it, but you don't. You just stop noticing it's there, which might actually be worse because it means your nose has surrendered to the inevitable. The landlord, who definitely doesn't live here because they value their own quality of life, has packed as many people as physically possible into every available space. A building designed for maybe 30 people comfortably. Try 80. A room meant for 2. How about 8? The concept of personal space hasn't just died. It's been murdered, buried, and then dug up again to fit one more tenant in the grave. It's like playing Tetris with human beings, except nobody wins, and everyone loses. The entrance hallway is dark, narrow, and often slippery with substances you don't want to identify. There's no gaslighting here. That costs money, and landlords believe that light is a luxury item, like caviar or happiness. You navigate by memory and hope, shuffling through the darkness, occasionally bumping into other residents who are equally blind and equally tired. It's like a very depressing obstacle course, where the obstacles are other people and the prize for finishing is a terrible bed. The staircase, assuming the building has multiple floors, is a death trap. The steps are uneven. The banister is loose and several treads are missing entirely. Climbing these stairs in the dark after a 14-hour shift is an extreme sport. You've seen people fall, heard the sickening thuds and cries, but there's no emergency lighting, no safety rails, no landlord liability. You just step over the injured person and keep climbing because you're too tired to be a good Samaritan, and also they'll probably be fine tomorrow. Probably. Your room is on the 3rd floor, which means you're closer to the leaking roof and further from any possible escape route in case of fire. But hey, at least the rent is slightly cheaper than the ground floor rooms, where you have the privilege of hearing every person coming and going and also dealing with rats the size of house cats. Silver linings, remember? You push open the door to your room, and the term room is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. It's more of a large closet, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, with a ceiling so low that taller people have to walk bent over. There are no windows, or if there is a window, it looks out onto a brick wall 3 inches away. Natural light is a distant memory. Fresh air is a myth. This is your private space, except it's not private and it's barely space. The walls are thin enough that you can hear everything happening in the neighbouring rooms, and I mean everything. Conversations, arguments, coughing fits that last for hours, couples having relations, children crying, someone's uncle dying loudly at 2 a.m. It's like living inside a radio that only plays the saddest, most uncomfortable station. You learn intimate details about your neighbours' lives, whether you want to or not, which creates a weird, forced intimacy where you know exactly when Bob next door gets home drunk, but you've never actually met Bob. The floor is bare wood, warped and splintered, with gaps between the boards wide enough that you can see into the room below. In winter, cold air rushes up through these gaps like the building is exhaling ice. In summer, the heat rises from below and turns your room into a sauna. Year-round, bugs travel freely between floors, treating the gaps like a highway system designed specifically for cockroaches and beetles. You've stopped trying to kill them. There are too many, and honestly, they were here first. There's no furniture except what you brought or scavenged. Most rooms have a simple wooden bed frame, if you're lucky, or just a corner of the floor designated as your sleeping area. A small table made from an old crate, maybe a nail hammered into the wall to hang your coat. That's it. That's your entire living space. Marie Kondo would have a breakdown. The minimalism isn't intentional. It's just all you can afford and all that fits. The landlord provides absolutely nothing beyond the physical space. No heating, no lighting, no bedding, no cleaning services. You want heat? Figure it out yourself. Want to see at night? Bring your own candles and try not to burn down the building. Want to not sleep on bare wood? Better have brought a blanket. The landlord's philosophy is simple. I provide walls and a roof. Terms and conditions apply to the roof. Everything else is your problem. Water is available from a shared pump in the courtyard behind the building. 1 pump for 80 people. You carry water up to your room in whatever container you own, which means multiple trips up those death trap stairs while exhausted. Want to wash yourself? Haul water. Want to clean your clothes? Haul water. Want a drink that isn't weak beer? Haul water. It's like CrossFit, except instead of getting fit, you just get exhausted and resentful. The courtyard itself is a nightmare. It's a small, enclosed space that never sees direct sunlight, paved with broken cobblestones and dominated by the communal privy. A wooden shack with a hole over a cesspit that hasn't been emptied since the last monarch. The smell from this privy permeates everything. It wafts up through windows, seeps through walls, and generally makes you question whether humans deserve to exist. Using this toilet requires holding your breath, speed, and a strong stomach. It's less restroom and more nightmare facility. Laundry hangs on lines stretched across the courtyard, dripping on anyone unfortunate enough to walk underneath. In winter, clothes freeze solid on the lines and have to be brought inside stiff as boards to slowly thaw. In summer, they collect soot from the surrounding factories and never really get clean. The concept of fresh laundry smell doesn't exist here. The best you can hope for is slightly less filthy than before. Privacy is impossible. Your room shares walls with multiple neighbours, the door has gaps around it, and the walls are so thin that your neighbour's candle flame casts shadows into your room. Everyone knows everyone's business. If you cough, 3 people will comment on it the next day. If you cry, you'll hear sympathetic crying from next door. If you argue with your spouse, the entire floor will know by breakfast. It's forced community through architectural failure. The landlord visits once a week to collect rent, and this visit is the most terrifying moment of the week. Can't pay? You're out immediately. Your few possessions thrown into the street. Your spot filled within hours by someone even more desperate. The landlord doesn't care about your sick child, your factory injury, your recent fine at work, money or leave. Those are the only options. It's capitalism distilled to its purest, cruelest form. You're only worth your ability to pay, and the moment you can't pay, you're discarded like trash. Some lodging houses offered 4-penny coffins, literal wooden boxes where you could sleep sitting up for 4p per night. Can't afford a room? Sleep in a box. Can't afford a box? Sleep in the street. The hierarchy of misery had layers, and you could always fall further. At least you had a room. At least you had a door. At least you weren't sleeping standing up in an alley. These thoughts didn't comfort you, but they did put things in perspective. And fires. Let's talk about fires. Lodging houses burned down regularly because they were wooden fire traps filled with exhausted people, using candles and sometimes trying to heat their rooms with improvised braziers. Multiple families, narrow staircases, no fire escapes, no sprinklers, no fire department that cared about poor neighbourhoods. When a lodging house caught fire, people died, lots of people. But new tenants moved in within weeks because housing was scarce, and memories were short and nobody in power cared enough to implement safety regulations. This was home. This was where you slept, ate your cold meals, maybe tried to have a conversation with your family if you still had energy for such luxuries. This was where children grew up, where couples tried to maintain relationships, where the elderly waited to die. The lodging house wasn't just accommodation. It was a physical representation of your place in society. You were worth exactly as much space as your wages could buy, which wasn't much. Welcome home. Privacy in industrial Manchester. Hilarious. Most factory workers couldn't afford their own bed, so they shared. And I don't mean sharing with a romantic partner or even a sibling. I mean sharing with strangers, colleagues, and occasionally someone's cousin who just arrived from the countryside and brought his fleas as luggage. The concept was simple and horrifying. Beds were expensive, space was limited, wages were terrible, so multiple people would rent space in the same bed to split costs. It's like having roommates, except instead of sharing an apartment, you're sharing a piece of furniture, and instead of having your own room, you have approximately 2 feet of mattress real estate. Sometimes you knew your bedmates. More often, you didn't. You'd come home exhausted, climb into bed and discover you were spooning with Jim from the dye works and Margaret who coughs blood. Welcome to communal sleeping Victorian style. The most common arrangement was 2 to 3 people per bed, which sounds manageable until you remember that these weren't king-sized beds. These were narrow, sagging affairs, barely big enough for one person comfortably. Add 3 adults, and you're playing a nightly game of Tetris where the pieces are elbows, knees, and someone's cold feet shoved against your back. You learn to sleep very still or risk starting a chain reaction of disturbed sleepers that ended with everyone awake and angry. Some lodging houses operated on a shift system that was ingenious and appalling in equal measure. Day shift workers would sleep at night, then vacate the bed in the morning so night shift workers could sleep during the day. The bed was literally never empty, maintaining its own ecosystem of warmth, sweat, and microscopic life forms. It's like time-sharing a condo, except the condo is a disease-ridden mattress and nobody's getting a vacation out of it. The sheets, if they existed, were changed maybe once a month. Maybe. The bed had achieved a sort of biological permanence independent of any individual sleeper. Hot bedding, as this delightful practice was called, meant you'd climb into a bed that was still warm from the previous occupant. And not a pleasant, cosy warm, a damp, slightly suspicious warm. You tried not to think about it. You tried not to think about what the previous sleeper might have done in this bed. You just closed your eyes and accepted that this was your life now. Sleeping in other people's residual body heat, because that's what poverty looked like. For families, bed sharing was even more complex. Parents, children, sometimes grandparents, all piled into one or two beds. Infants slept between parents for warmth, toddlers at the foot of the bed, older children squeezed in wherever they'd fit. Privacy for married couples was essentially non-existent. Want to have a private conversation? Too bad, your 5 children are right there listening to everything. Want to be intimate with your spouse? Better wait until everyone's deeply asleep and hope nobody wakes up traumatized. It was family bonding taken to its most uncomfortable extreme. The sleeping positions you developed were a survival skill. Most people slept on their sides because there wasn't enough space to lie on your back. You'd work out an arrangement, big spoon, little spoon, medium spoon, and stick to it because shifting positions required cooperation from everyone else in the bed. One person wants to roll over, everybody rolls over. It's synchronized sleeping whether you wanted it or not. Olympic teams have shown less coordination. Snoring was a community problem. If one person snored, everyone suffered. You couldn't just move to the couch because there was no couch, and the floor was even worse than the bed. You'd try nudging the snorer, but that required reaching over 2 other people, and then you'd wake everyone up anyway. So you just lay there, listening to what sounded like a wood saw working through wet logs, wondering if this was karma for something terrible you'd done in a past life. Temperature regulation was impossible. In winter, body heat from multiple people was actually beneficial. You were essentially creating a human furnace. But in summer, forget about it. 3 or 4 people generating heat in a small, unventilated room with no air circulation turned the bed into a sweat-soaked nightmare. You'd wake up stuck to the person next to you, everyone's body fluids mixing in a soup of discomfort. It's like sleeping in a humid, human terrarium. Nobody's comfortable, everyone's damp, and morning can't come soon enough, except morning means going to the factory, so actually maybe sleep is better. The worst part was sleeping next to people who were sick, which was always because everyone was sick with something. Tuberculosis was rampant, and it loved close quarters. Your bedmate would cough all night, spraying droplets into the shared air, and you'd just lie there breathing it all in because where else were you going to go? You couldn't afford to be choosy about your sleeping arrangements. If someone had consumption, well, you probably had it too now. Congratulations on your new chronic illness, courtesy of the bed-sharing economy. Children were particularly vulnerable in shared sleeping arrangements. Infants sometimes didn't survive the night because exhausted parents would accidentally roll over on them. It happened frequently enough that there was a term for it: overlaying. It wasn't intentional. Parents were just so deeply exhausted from factory work that they'd fall into unconscious sleep and tragedy would follow. The guilt must have been unbearable, but what could they do? They couldn't afford separate sleeping spaces. They couldn't afford anything. Poverty killed in ways both obvious and heartbreaking. Bedbugs thrived in shared beds. These little vampires loved the constant supply of warm bodies, and they'd feast nightly on everyone simultaneously. You'd wake up covered in itchy bites, and so would everyone else in the bed. It was a shared misery that somehow didn't bring people together so much as make everyone equally irritable. Fighting over bed space while simultaneously covered in bug bites creates a special kind of resentment. You couldn't even be mad at specific people, because everyone was equally victimized by the situation. Personal belongings were another issue. Where do you store your things when you share a bed with strangers? Answer: you don't. You kept everything on your person or risked it being stolen while you slept. Trust wasn't a luxury anyone could afford. That person sharing your bed might be perfectly nice during waking hours, but desperation makes thieves of honest people. Your boots, your coat, the few coins you hadn't spent yet, all had to be guarded. Some people literally slept with their boots on to prevent theft. Nothing says restful sleep like wearing shoes to bed. The morning wake-up routine was chaos. Everyone had different shift start times, which meant people were constantly climbing over each other to get out of bed. You'd be sleeping, then suddenly someone's elbow is in your face because Jim needs to get to the 5 a.m. shift. 10 minutes later, Margaret's leaving for the textile mill. Half an hour after that, someone else is getting up. Continuous sleep was impossible. You learned to sleep through disturbances, or you didn't sleep at all. And not sleeping meant you'd be even more exhausted at the factory, which meant more accidents, which meant potential death or dismemberment. The stakes of a bad night's sleep were considerably higher than they are today. Some workers couldn't even afford bed space. They'd pay a penny or two to sleep sitting up on a bench, leaning on a rope stretched across the room. When morning came, the landlord would cut the rope and everyone would fall forward, instantly awake. It was called a 2-penny hangover, and yes, it was as terrible as it sounds. Imagine paying money for the privilege of sleeping sitting up, then being literally dropped as your alarm clock. Makes your worst hostel experience look like a luxury spa. Married couples who wanted their own bed faced social pressure to take in lodgers anyway, because the extra income was necessary for survival. So you'd be trying to maintain some semblance of married life while two strangers from the factory shared your bed. Romance was dead, murdered by economic necessity and the physical presence of your co-worker Dave, who smelled like machine oil and had opinions about everything. The shared bed wasn't just a sleeping arrangement. It was a symbol of how thoroughly industrial capitalism had invaded every aspect of workers' lives. You couldn't even be alone in sleep. Every moment, every space, every breath was shared, commodified and exploited. The most private act, sleep, had become communal out of sheer economic desperation. And this was normal. This was just how things were. Generations grew up thinking shared beds were standard, that privacy was something only rich people had. That personal space was a fairy tale. Welcome to bed sharing in industrial Manchester, where the only thing more crowded than your workplace was your sleeping space. And the only thing guaranteed was that you'd never, ever get enough rest. The mattress in your shared bed wasn't filled with memory foam or comfortable down feathers. It was stuffed with straw, horsehair, or whatever organic material the landlord could scrape together that wouldn't immediately rot. Over time, this bedding became a biological experiment, hosting entire ecosystems of bugs, mould, and mysterious stains that predated your tenancy. Let's start with the mattress itself, which is generous terminology for what was essentially a large sack. The outer covering was rough canvas or ticking, coarse fabric that could scratch your skin through your clothes. Inside was straw, if you were lucky. Straw was cheap, readily available, and provided minimal cushioning between your body and the wooden bed frame beneath. The problem with straw is that it's organic, which means it breaks down. After a few months of being compressed by multiple bodies night after night, the straw turned into dust and chaff. You weren't sleeping on a mattress anymore. You were sleeping on a bag of agricultural debris. The straw would poke through the ticking, creating sharp little needles that jabbed you throughout the night. You'd shift positions and feel a sudden stab in your shoulder blade. Roll over and get poked in the ribs. It's like sleeping on a bed made of angry hedgehogs. Over time, the pokes created small holes in the fabric, which allowed the straw dust to escape and fill the air you breathed. Congrats, you're now inhaling your bed. Your morning cough isn't just from the factory, it's from sleeping on decomposing plants. Some mattresses were filled with horsehair instead, which sounds fancier, but wasn't. Horsehair was scratchy, retained odours magnificently, and provided slightly more support than straw while being equally uncomfortable. The real issue with horsehair was that it came from horses, which meant it often came with horse parasites, lice, mites, various microscopic creatures that saw your warm body as a luxury resort. They'd migrate from the horsehair into your hair, creating a parasitic chain of misery. It's like the circle of life, except everyone's itching. The worst mattresses were filled with rags, Old clothing, scraps of fabric, whatever textile waste the landlord could acquire for free. These rag mattresses were lumpy, uneven, and had the consistency of sleeping on a pile of laundry that gave up on itself. They'd developed permanent body-shaped depressions where sleepers had compressed the rags into near-solid masses. If you were the third person to use a rag mattress that day, you were sleeping in someone else's body groove. It's personalised comfort, except the person it's personalised for isn't you. Mattresses were never cleaned. Never. The concept of mattress maintenance didn't exist in lodging houses. You'd sleep on the same mattress for months or years, and it would just accumulate everything. Sweat, dead skin cells, various bodily fluids, food crumbs, bug corpses. The mattress became a historical record of everyone who'd ever slept there. A timeline of human existence pressed into degrading organic matter. Archaeologists could probably carbon date these things. The smell was indescribable, but I'll try anyway. Imagine wet dog, mixed with old socks, combined with that weird smell old books have, but make it alive and actively hostile. That's your mattress. The smell intensified in summer and became slightly less aggressive in winter, but it never actually went away. You got used to it the same way you got used to everything else, through sheer desperation and lack of alternatives. Your nose staged a protest, then gave up and joined the resistance by simply shutting down. Bedbugs loved these mattresses the way real estate investors love gentrification. The seams, the stuffing, the wooden frame, all perfect hiding spots. During the day, they'd nestle deep in the mattress layers, digesting their previous night's meal of your blood. At night, they'd emerge like tiny vampires for the dinner buffet. You could feel them crawling sometimes. Little tickling sensations across your skin that made you want to set everything on fire. Some workers did exactly that, burning their bedding in desperate attempts at pest control, then having to sleep on bare wood because they couldn't afford replacements. Fleas were also residents. They'd live in the straw or horsehair, breeding in the warm, moist environment created by multiple sweating bodies. You'd wake up with flea bites on your ankles, your legs, anywhere the little demons could access. The itching was constant and maddening. Scratching provided temporary relief but broke the skin, which led to infections, which could kill you in an era before antibiotics. Death by flea bite sounds ridiculous until you remember that's basically how the plague worked. Sheets, if they existed at all, were thin, rough, and changed approximately never. Most lodging houses didn't provide sheets because that would require washing them, which cost money. You'd bring your own if you could afford them, which you couldn't, so you slept directly on the mattress ticking. The direct contact meant your body oils, sweat, and dead skin went straight into the mattress, feeding the bug population and accelerating the decomposition process. You were essentially composting yourself nightly. In winter, the thin blankets provided were woefully inadequate. One threadbare blanket per person, if you were lucky. More often, one blanket per bed, which meant sharing it with your bedmates. This led to nightly tug-of-war contests where people would unconsciously pull the blanket toward themselves while sleeping, leaving others exposed to the freezing air. You'd wake up shivering, realise someone had stolen all the blanket and have to yank it back, waking everyone in the process. It's a cycle of thermal theft and mutual resentment. The blankets themselves were wool, which sounds warm until you remember that this wool hadn't been washed since it was sheared from the sheep. It was scratchy, full of lanolin and sheep dirt and absolutely riddled with moths. Moth holes gave the blankets a Swiss cheese quality that was less rustic charm and more complete structural failure. The holes let cold air through, defeating the entire purpose of having a blanket, but you couldn't complain because having a holey blanket was still better than having no blanket. Some workers couldn't afford blankets at all. They'd sleep in their coats, using their spare clothes as makeshift covers. This meant your daytime clothes were your nighttime bedding, which accelerated their deterioration and meant you smelled like bed all day at work. Not that anyone could tell. Everyone smelled like bed all day at work. The collective odour in the factory was a democracy of different stenches, all equally offensive. Pillows were a luxury item. Most workers didn't have them. You'd rest your head on your bundled-up coat, or on a rolled-up sack, or just directly on the mattress. This led to neck problems, headaches, and a permanent crick in your spine that modern chiropractors would need 5 sessions just to diagnose. Your head would sink into the compressed straw, creating a divot that didn't provide support so much as create a head-shaped crater. It's ergonomics designed by someone who hated ergonomics. For those who did have pillows, they were usually stuffed with more straw or rags, equally lumpy and uncomfortable. Over time, the pillow would flatten completely, becoming a sad pancake that did nothing but give you false hope that tonight might be different. The pillowcases, if they existed, were stained with years of hair oil, drool and sweat. They'd be stiff with dried fluids, standing up on their own like they were haunted. Washing them required water, soap, time and energy, all things you didn't have, so they just continued accumulating biological residue. The bed frame itself was usually wood, often homemade or salvaged, held together with hope and the occasional nail. It would creak and groan with every movement, creating a soundtrack to your misery. The slats supporting the mattress would sag or break, causing the middle of the bed to sink dramatically. This created a valley effect where everyone rolled toward the centre, piling on top of each other involuntarily. You'd try to sleep on the edge to avoid the pile-up, but then you'd risk rolling off entirely and hitting the floor. Some beds didn't have proper frames at all, just planks laid across supports, or even just straw and blankets directly on the floor. Floor sleeping was marginally better than nothing, but it meant you were closer to the rats, the cold from below, and the floods when it rained and water seeped through the floorboards. You'd wake up damp, cold, and questioning all your life choices. Not that you had many choices, but still, it was worth questioning them. The bedding situation was so universally terrible that it created a sort of solidarity among workers. Everyone's mattress was horrible. Everyone's blanket was inadequate. Everyone had bugs. It wasn't just you, it was systemic bedding failure across the entire working class. This shared misery didn't make things better, but at least you knew you weren't alone in your suffering. Small comfort when you're trying to sleep on what amounts to a bag of hostile organic matter, but you took what comfort you could get. And replacing any of this bedding? Impossibly expensive. A new mattress cost more than a week's wages, a decent blanket same. So you just kept using the same degrading materials until they literally fell apart. Then you try to patch them together or replace them with equally terrible used items from rag dealers. It was a cycle of bedding poverty that matched your financial poverty, creating a perfect storm of discomfort that followed you from the factory to your supposed place of rest. Welcome to Victorian bedding, where the only thing well rested is the ecosystem of parasites living in your mattress. Blankets were precious commodities in industrial Manchester, which meant most workers owned exactly one thin, scratchy excuse for a covering that had been passed down through generations and accumulated more history than a museum. Sharing blankets wasn't romantic. It was mandatory, desperate, and often disease-spreading. The typical worker's blanket was a thin wool affair that had seen better decades. It started life as grey or brown, but after years of use, sweat, and never being properly washed, it had achieved a colour that can only be described as historical grime. It was stiff in places where bodily fluids had dried and re-dried, soft in others where the fabric had worn completely through, and overall had the texture of something that had given up on being fabric and was transitioning into a new state of matter entirely. In a shared bed with 3 or 4 people, one blanket had to cover everyone. This was mathematically impossible, which meant someone was always getting the short end of the deal. Literally. The blanket would be pulled in multiple directions throughout the night as sleepers unconsciously tried to claim more coverage. You'd go to sleep with a corner of blanket and wake up with nothing, shivering in the pre-dawn cold, while the person next to you had somehow mummified themselves in the entire thing. It's like a nightly property dispute, except the property is threadbare wool and everyone's asleep so nobody can argue effectively. The blanket-pulling wars were real and vicious. You'd develop strategies, tuck your corner under your body to anchor it, sleep on top of it partially to claim territory, wrap yourself tight before the others could steal your share. Some workers would wake up multiple times per night just to reclaim their blanket portion. It was exhausting on top of already being exhausted, creating a cycle of sleep deprivation that made everything worse. You were tired at work not just from the 14-hour shifts, but from spending the night fighting over textile real estate. Families had it worse because they had to share blankets across different generations. Grandparents, parents, children, all huddling under whatever covers they collectively owned, which was usually 2 or 3 blankets for a family of 6 or 7. Priority went to the youngest and oldest, because they were most vulnerable to the cold. Everyone else just had to toughen up and shiver. Parents would often give up their blanket share entirely to keep their children warm, sacrificing their own comfort and health. It was love expressed through freezing. The blankets themselves were disease vectors of remarkable efficiency. Tuberculosis, typhoid, scarlet fever, smallpox. These diseases spread beautifully through shared blankets. Someone coughed into the blanket. Now everyone's breathing those droplets all night. Someone had a fever and sweated profusely. Those bacteria are now coating the entire blanket, ready to infect the next person. It's like a petri dish you cuddle with. Modern epidemiologists would look at Victorian blanket sharing practices and weep. Washing blankets was theoretically possible, but practically impossible. It required hauling massive amounts of water, heating it, finding enough soap, which cost money, actually washing the heavy, waterlogged blanket and then drying it. In winter, a wet blanket could take days to dry, and you couldn't exactly go without a blanket while waiting. So most blankets went months or years between washings. Some were never washed at all, just used until they disintegrated, at which point they were replaced with another equally filthy second-hand blanket. The smell of an unwashed shared blanket is difficult to convey to people who've only experienced modern, regularly laundered bedding. It was layers of smell, the base note of lanolin from the wool, middle notes of human sweat and skin oils, top notes of whatever diseases were currently flourishing. In summer, the smell would intensify until it became almost visible. You'd wrap yourself in this olfactory assault every night because the alternative was freezing to death. Your nose learned to dissociate from your survival instincts. Some enterprising workers would try to supplement their blankets with newspapers, using them as an extra layer of insulation. Paper actually provided decent insulation, and it was cheaper than wool. The downside was that newspaper was crinkly and would make noise with every movement, creating a constant rustling soundtrack to your sleep. Also, the ink would transfer onto your skin and clothes, so you'd wake up with backwards text printed on your face. Nothing says professional factory worker like having yesterday's news headlines stamped on your forehead in mirror image. Blanket theft was a serious concern. A decent blanket was valuable enough to steal, which meant you couldn't leave it unattended. Some workers would take their blankets to work with them, draping them over their shoulders during the walk to and from the factory, because leaving a blanket in your lodging house room meant it might not be there when you returned. Trust was a luxury, and blankets were worth more than trust. It's like living in a world where everyone's one wool covering away from hypothermia, and moral principles are negotiable. Children grew up learning to sleep with minimal covering. They'd curl into tight balls to conserve heat, developing that fetal position sleeping style out of pure necessity. Parents would layer children together under one blanket, 2 or 3 kids sharing warmth like a pile of puppies. It was cute in a desperately sad way. These children would grow up thinking that comfortable sleep was something that happened to other people, that cold was just part of existence, that nighttime was meant to be endured rather than enjoyed. During the absolute worst cold snaps, when temperatures plummeted and the thin walls did nothing to keep winter at bay, families would resort to desperate measures. They'd pile all their clothing on top of themselves as makeshift blankets. Coats, shawls, spare shirts, anything that could provide an extra layer. This meant your entire wardrobe was now your bedding, which meant your clothes smelled like bed, worse than they already did, but at least you didn't freeze solid overnight. Fashion wasn't the priority. Surviving until morning was. Some lodging houses rented out extra blankets for an additional fee, 1 or 2 pence per night to borrow a slightly thicker blanket. For workers already struggling to afford basic rent and food, this extra charge was often impossible. But on the coldest nights, some people would scrape together the coins because frostbite and pneumonia were real threats. The landlords knew this, of course, and exploited it beautifully. It's capitalism at its finest, creating artificial scarcity of basic necessities and then charging desperate people for access to survival. The rental blankets were, naturally, even filthier than the blankets you already owned, having been used by dozens of sick, sweaty tenants before you. The psychological impact of never being warm enough to sleep cannot be overstated. Your body never fully relaxed because it was constantly trying to generate heat, keep muscles tense to create warmth. This meant your sleep was lighter, less restorative, filled with half-conscious moments of pulling at blankets or curling tighter. You'd wake up still tired because your body had been working all night just to maintain temperature. It's like running a marathon while unconscious. You're expending energy constantly even though you're supposedly resting. In summer, the blanket situation reversed but remained equally miserable. Now you didn't need the blanket for warmth, but you still needed some covering because sleeping completely exposed felt vulnerable, and also the bugs were worse without protection. So you'd suffer under a blanket in the sweltering heat, sweating through the night, because uncovered sleep somehow felt worse. The blanket had become a security object, a psychological necessity even when it was physically uncomfortable. Stockholm Syndrome, but make it textile-based. Blankets were also used for privacy in the rare instances when people wanted or needed it. Hanging a blanket across part of the room created a temporary partition. A woman giving birth might have a blanket hung to create minimal privacy. A sick person might be sectioned off behind a blanket to give them some semblance of isolation, though it did nothing to stop disease from spreading. The blanket as room divider was optimistic at best. Sound and smell went right through it. But humans need the illusion of privacy even when actual privacy is impossible. The emotional attachment people developed to their blankets was both touching and tragic. A blanket might be the only possession that followed you through your entire life. You were born under it, you'd probably die under it, and every night in between you'd wrap yourself in its scratchy, smelly, insufficient embrace. It was yours in a world where you owned almost nothing. Workers would patch and repair their blankets obsessively, stitching holes, reinforcing corners, trying to extend the life of this one precious thing. When a blanket finally died, torn beyond repair or rotted through, it was a genuine loss. You'd have to find a replacement, which meant spending money you didn't have or accepting a hand-me-down that was somehow even worse. Some factories actually sold blankets to workers through payment plans, deducting small amounts from weekly wages over months. It was predatory lending applied to bedding. The blanket would be worn out by the time you finished paying for it, and the interest meant you paid 3 times its actual value. But people did it anyway because freezing wasn't an option, and immediate cold was worse than future debt. The factory owners probably laughed all the way to the bank, having figured out how to profit from their workers' need for basic warmth. And through all of this, the sharing, the stealing, the disease, the insufficient coverage, the smell, workers just accepted it as normal. This is what blankets were. This is what sleep involved. The concept that everyone might have their own clean, warm, adequate blanket was so foreign it might as well have been science fiction. Comfort wasn't a right, it was a distant dream, something rich people had that you'd heard about but never experienced. So you pulled your corner of the shared, scratchy, disease-ridden blanket closer, hoped tonight you wouldn't lose the tug of war, and tried to sleep despite the cold, the smell, and the knowledge that tomorrow would be exactly the same. Welcome to blanket life in industrial Manchester, where warmth was rationed and disease was included free of charge. Here's the thing about lodging houses in Victorian Manchester. They were colder inside than outside. The landlords didn't provide heating because, well, that would cost money. And why invest in your tenants' comfort when you could invest in literally anything else? Walls were thin, windows were drafty, and the concept of insulation was apparently still being workshopped. The temperature inside your room on a winter night hovered somewhere between meat locker and cryogenic preservation chamber. You could see your breath indoors, which is always a fun sign that your living conditions are appropriate for human habitation. Each exhale created a little cloud of condensation that hung in the air briefly before dissipating, a visible reminder that you were essentially camping, except you paid rent for this experience, and there were no s'mores to make it worthwhile. The walls, those thin barriers between you and the Manchester winter, were about as effective as a strongly worded letter to the cold. Single brick thickness in many cases, no cavity wall insulation, no plaster thick enough to matter. The cold didn't just seep through these walls, it marched through confidently like it owned the place, which it basically did. You could place your hand flat against the interior wall and feel the outdoor temperature directly. It's like the wall was just there for decoration, architectural suggestion, rather than actual protection. Windows were the worst offenders. The frames were wooden, warped from years of moisture and temperature changes, creating gaps you could slide a finger through. The glass, when it existed and wasn't just broken and covered with rags, was single pane and did approximately nothing to stop cold transfer. Frost would form on the inside of the windows by December, creating beautiful crystalline patterns that would be artistic if they weren't a sign that you were living in conditions that violated several laws of thermal comfort. The gaps around window frames created wind tunnels. You'd feel a constant breeze in your room, even with the window closed. At night, you could hear the wind whistling through the cracks, a mournful sound that seemed designed specifically to remind you that nature was winning. Some people would stuff rags into the gaps, creating makeshift weather stripping, but this was like trying to stop a flood with paper towels. It helped marginally, which is to say it didn't help at all, but it made you feel like you were doing something. The floor was another thermal disaster. Cold rose from below like the lodging house was built on top of an ice floe. The wooden floorboards had gaps between them, and cold air from the room below would rush up, creating a permanent draft at ankle height. Your feet were always cold. Always. Even if the rest of your body somehow achieved a tolerable temperature through sheer body heat and desperation, your feet remained frozen blocks attached to your legs. Frostbite on toes was common enough that losing a toe wasn't even noteworthy. It was just something that happened to people sometimes. There was no heating system, none. The concept of radiators, central heating, or even a simple fireplace in your room was laughable. Fireplaces cost money to build and maintain, and more importantly they'd require providing fuel to tenants, which landlords viewed as an unreasonable expense. Some lodging houses had a single shared fireplace in a common room, where dozens of people would crowd around fighting for warmth like medieval peasants around a village fire. Spoiler, they were basically medieval peasants, just with more machinery. If you wanted heat in your room, you had to provide it yourself. Some workers would bring small braziers, metal containers where you could burn coal or wood chips. This sounds like a solution until you remember that fuel cost money you didn't have, and burning coal in an unventilated room could kill you via carbon monoxide poisoning. But hey, at least you'd die warm. Silver lining? The risk of fire in these wooden buildings packed with exhausted people using improvised heating was astronomical. But when the choice is between possible death by fire and certain death by freezing, people took their chances. Body heat became a survival strategy. This is why sharing beds wasn't just about saving money, it was about not dying. 3 people in a bed generated more warmth than 1 person alone. You'd huddle together not out of affection, but out of thermoregulatory necessity. It's like being penguins, except penguins have better housing conditions and more supportive community structures. The person in the middle of the bed had the best position, surrounded by warmth. The people on the edges basically accepted they'd be cold on one entire side of their body all night. Your breath would condense on your blanket during the night, creating a thin layer of ice by morning. You'd wake up with your blanket frozen stiff around you like you'd been encased in a textile cocoon. Getting out of this frozen blanket to face the even colder air required motivational levels usually reserved for emergency situations. Some workers would lay in bed until the absolute last possible moment, until the risk of being late to work finally outweighed the misery of leaving the marginal warmth of their bedding. The morning routine was torture. Your clothes had frozen overnight. If you'd washed anything the night before, forget about it. It was now a cloth ice sculpture. You'd have to warm your clothes against your body or wear them frozen, and hope body heat eventually thawed them. Pulling on frozen trousers is an experience that builds character, and by character I mean resentment toward everyone whose idea this industrial revolution was. Water left in containers would freeze solid. This meant no morning wash, no way to clean yourself, no ability to prepare even basic food. You'd have to chip ice out of your water bucket if you wanted a drink, which added an extra layer of entertainment to your morning routine. It's like camping again, except you're about to go operate dangerous machinery for 14 hours, so the stakes are slightly higher than a weekend trip to the woods. Children suffered especially in these conditions. Their smaller bodies lost heat faster, and they didn't have the same metabolic capacity to generate warmth as adults. Parents would wrap children in every piece of clothing they owned, creating little padded bundles that could barely move. Children would sleep between parents, using adult bodies as living heating elements. Infant mortality spiked in winter, with cold being either a direct cause or a contributing factor in countless deaths. The Victorian attitude seemed to be, children are resilient, which translated to, if they survive childhood, they're strong enough to be exploited in factories. The elderly face similar challenges. Older workers whose bodies were already breaking down from decades of factory labour couldn't maintain body temperature as effectively. They'd need more warmth but had even less ability to afford it. Some elderly workers would literally freeze to death in their rooms overnight, and neighbours would discover them in the morning stiff and cold, having lost their final battle against Manchester's winter. It was considered sad but inevitable, just another cost of industrial progress. Illness thrived in these conditions. Pneumonia, bronchitis, tuberculosis, all loved the combination of cold, damp and crowded living conditions. Your immune system was already compromised from poor nutrition and exhaustion, and now it had to fight off diseases while you were slowly freezing. Many workers developed chronic respiratory conditions that they'd carry for life, assuming their life lasted long enough to call anything chronic. Coughing was so universal that silence would have been suspicious. Some rooms actually had ice form on the interior walls near windows. Ice. Inside. On the walls. This isn't poetic exaggeration. This literally happened. You'd wake up and see frost patterns spreading across your wall like frozen ferns, beautiful and completely horrifying. The walls would sweat condensation during the day when temperatures marginally increased, creating damp patches that never dried and encouraged mould growth. So you got to choose between frozen walls or mouldy walls, and sometimes you got both in different parts of the same room. The psychological impact of never being warm cannot be overstated. Cold becomes your default state, your baseline existence. You stop remembering what comfortable feels like. Your body is constantly stressed, constantly working to maintain core temperature, burning calories you don't have to spare just to avoid hypothermia. This chronic cold stress contributed to the general exhaustion that defined factory workers' lives. You were tired not just from work but from your body's constant struggle against the cold. There was no escape from it. Factory was cold, streets were cold, home was cold. The only difference was what type of cold you were experiencing. Wet cold from the rain-soaked streets, dry cold from the unheated rooms, windy cold from the drafty factory. It was a comprehensive educational program in the many varieties of misery that cold can inflict on a human body. By the end of winter, you were basically a cold expert. Congratulations on your degree in suffering. Some workers developed permanent circulation problems from years of cold exposure. Your fingers and toes would turn white at the slightest drop in temperature, a condition now known as a Raynaud's phenomenon. Your joints would ache constantly from the cold and damp. Arthritis developed early and progressed fast. By age 40, many workers moved like they were 80, joints stiff and painful, bodies aged prematurely by decades of cold. It's accelerated aging, except instead of some fancy medical procedure. It's just poverty. The cruelest irony. Manchester's factories were heated. Sort of. The machinery generated warmth. Steam engines pumped heat through the buildings. Factory owners understood that extreme cold affected productivity and could damage equipment. But workers' homes? Those didn't produce profit directly, so why waste money heating them? The factory where you spent 14 hours was marginally warmer than the room where you spent 8 hours sleeping. Your workplace had better climate control than your home, which really says something about priorities in industrial capitalism. And summer provided no relief because the buildings that were too cold in winter were too hot in summer. The poor ventilation and lack of insulation meant rooms would bake during heat waves, creating entirely new forms of misery. But at least in summer you weren't worried about losing toes to frostbite, so that was progress. Victorian lodging houses proved that architecture could fail in multiple seasons simultaneously, a real achievement in poor design. Welcome to room temperature regulation in industrial Manchester, where the thermostat setting was whatever nature decides, and your comfort level was not a consideration. Where indoor and outdoor temperatures competed to see which could make you more miserable, and somehow indoor usually won. Factory workers didn't have closets full of winter coats and thermal underwear. They had whatever clothes they owned, which wasn't much, and they wore all of it simultaneously. The fashion strategy was simple. Put on every single garment you possess and pray that physics somehow generates warmth through sheer volume. Your wardrobe, if you could call it that, consisted of maybe 2 or 3 complete outfits total. One set you wore constantly, one set that was slightly less worn that you saved for church or special occasions like not dying, and possibly a third set of rags that qualified as clothes only by the most generous definition. There was no winter wardrobe versus summer wardrobe. There was just the clothes I own, and hoping they last another year before disintegrating entirely. The base layer, if you were lucky enough to have one, was a linen or cotton shirt. This was supposed to absorb sweat and provide a barrier between your skin and the rougher outer garments. In practice, this shirt was thin, worn through in multiple places, and hadn't been properly washed in weeks because washing meant you couldn't wear it while it dried. And you couldn't exactly go shirtless in December. The shirt accumulated layers of sweat, skin oils, and factory grime until it achieved a sort of waxy coating that was probably providing more insulation than the original fabric. Over the shirt went a waistcoat if you owned one. Waistcoats were sleeveless wool garments that added a layer over your torso while keeping your arms mobile for factory work. They buttoned up the front with buttons that were often mismatched or missing entirely, replaced with whatever you could find: bits of bone, metal scavenged from broken equipment, wooden toggles whittled from scraps. Fashion wasn't the point. Functionality was barely the point. Not freezing was the point. On top of that came your jacket or coat, usually made of wool so thick and rough it could stand up on its own. This coat was your most valuable possession after your boots. You'd wear it year-round because you couldn't afford to own clothes specific to seasons. In summer you'd swelter. In winter you'd still be cold, but at least you'd tried. The coat would be patched in dozens of places, showing a history of tears and repairs like a textile battle map. Different fabric patches, different coloured thread, some areas stitched by you, others by your mother or wife, creating a mosaic of desperate mending. For your legs, you had trousers made from cotton, wool, or increasingly in the industrial age, cheap factory-made textiles that wore out twice as fast. These trousers fit poorly because custom tailoring was for rich people, and you bought yours second-hand from a rag dealer, or inherited them from a deceased relative. They'd be too long or too short, too tight or too loose, held up by rope or cloth belts because leather belts cost money. The knees would be worn through first, showing pale skin beneath, then patched again, until the patches had patches. Under your trousers, undergarments were aspirational. Long underwear existed but was expensive. Most workers just wore their regular trousers directly over their skin, which meant the rough fabric chafed constantly, and also you couldn't wash them frequently, so they became increasingly ripe as winter progressed. Some workers would stuff newspaper down their trouser legs for extra insulation. The paper crinkled when you walked and occasionally fell out at inopportune moments, but it was free and it helped marginally, which was better than nothing. Socks were another luxury. If you owned socks, they were hand-knitted wool, full of holes, darned repeatedly until they were more darning than original sock. The wool was scratchy, made your feet itch, and retained moisture magnificently, which meant once your feet got wet from rain or snow, they stayed wet all day. Wet wool socks in cold weather is a special kind of misery. They squelch with every step, freeze your toes, and create the perfect environment for foot rot and fungal infections. Some workers wore layers of rags wrapped around their feet instead of socks, which was basically the same experience but cheaper. Boots or shoes were critical and expensive. A decent pair of boots cost more than a week's wages, which meant most workers wore their boots until they literally fell apart. The soles would wear through first, and you'd stuff cardboard inside to create a temporary barrier between your foot and the cobblestones. Then the seams would split, and you'd tie them back together with string. The leather would crack and let in water. Eventually you'd be walking in what could generously be called shoe-shaped leather suggestions, rather than actual functional footwear. Going barefoot wasn't an option in industrial Manchester. The streets were paved with cobblestones when they were paved at all, covered in sharp industrial debris, coal dust, animal waste, and frozen puddles in winter. Walking barefoot meant cut feet, which meant infection, which meant death. So you maintained your dying boots through any means necessary, including coating them with animal fat to waterproof them, which made them smell terrible, but at least kept the rain out for a few more weeks. In winter, you'd layer everything, all your shirts at once. 3 thin shirts create more warmth than 1 thick one, or at least that's what you told yourself. Multiple waistcoats if you owned them. Your coat on top. Maybe a shawl or scarf wrapped around your neck and shoulders, probably borrowed from a family member or pieced together from fabric scraps. By the time you were fully dressed, you'd gained several inches in circumference and lost most of your mobility. Moving your arms fully was difficult. Bending over was an adventure. You waddled more than walked, like a poorly assembled textile snowman. Women had additional challenges. Their clothing was designed to be impractical. Long skirts that dragged through mud and factory grime. Multiple layers of petticoats that were meant to create the fashionable silhouette but provided minimal warmth. Corsets, which wealthy women wore for fashion. Working-class women often skipped because they restricted breathing and movement necessary for factory work. But they still had to maintain some level of propriety, which meant layers of uncomfortable clothing that got in the way while providing inadequate protection from cold. Children were dressed in miniature versions of adult poverty. Their clothes were usually hand-me-downs from older siblings, already worn and patched before they received them. Children outgrew clothes quickly, but new clothes weren't an option, so they'd wear too small garments until they literally couldn't fit anymore. Arms protruding from sleeves that stopped at the forearm. Ankles visible below trouser hems. Or they'd wear too large clothes, swimming in adult-sized coats, tripping over dragging hems, sleeves rolled up multiple times. It was like dressing children in clothes designed to fail. Hats were essential, but often missing. A wool cap could prevent significant heat loss from your head, but hats were easy to lose, expensive to replace, and often stolen. Some workers fashioned head coverings from rags, creating turban-like wrappings that looked ridiculous but provided some protection. Women would wrap shawls around their heads, covering their hair and ears. Going hatless in winter was painful. Your ears would ache from the cold, turning red, then white, then numb. Frostbitten ears were common enough that partially missing ears didn't draw much attention. Gloves were another impossible luxury. Your hands were your work tools, but protecting them was expensive. Most workers just shoved their hands in their pockets when possible, and suffered when it wasn't. Some made mittens from old socks or fabric scraps. Crude, fingerless affairs that let you maintain some dexterity while providing minimal warmth. In the factory, you couldn't wear gloves anyway because they get caught in machinery, so your hands were constantly exposed to cold and developing permanent damage from repeated freezing. The clothing never dried properly. You'd wear wet clothes because you didn't have dry alternatives. Your coat would get soaked in rain during your morning commute, and you'd wear it damp all day in the factory, then wear it wet again on your evening commute, then maybe try to dry it overnight in your freezing room where nothing dried, then put it on damp again the next morning. Chronic dampness was just your state of being. You existed in a perpetual state of moist misery, like a very cold, very sad amphibian. Washing clothes was an ordeal that most people avoided. It required water, soap, fuel to heat the water, time, energy, and a place to dry them. Most workers would wear their clothes for weeks or months between washings. You'd try to air them out, maybe shake off the worst of the dirt, pick off visible bugs, but actual washing? That was a rare event, maybe a few times per year at most. This meant your clothes accumulated impressive quantities of grime, sweat, and wildlife. The smell of a room full of factory workers in their winter clothing is indescribable, but I'll try. Imagine wet wool mixed with unwashed human, a dash of coal smoke, industrial chemicals from the factory, a base note of desperation, and a top note of various bodily functions. Everyone smelled. Everyone. It wasn't personal, it was systemic. You couldn't maintain hygiene when you didn't have access to clean water, soap, or the time and space to properly clean yourself or your clothes. The fashion of the upper classes seemed to exist in a completely different universe. Rich people were wearing multiple outfits per day, changing for different occasions, sending clothes to be laundered regularly. They had wardrobes with options, seasonal clothing, accessories. Meanwhile, you were wearing the same patched outfit for the 6th consecutive week and hoping the seam on your trousers held for another month. The class divide was visible in clothing. Rich people's clothes announced wealth and leisure. Poor people's clothes announced, "I'm one torn seam away from indecent exposure." Some factories required workers to wear specific clothing or banned certain items. Loose clothing could get caught in machinery, so you needed to be covered but not flowing. This was difficult when your clothing was falling apart and held together with hope. Women with long hair had to tie it back severely to prevent scalping by machinery, but hairpins cost money and their hair was often their only vanity. so it was a constant negotiation between safety and dignity. Repairs were constant and communal. Evenings in lodging houses would see people stitching, patching, darning, trying to extend the life of their deteriorating wardrobes. Thread was expensive, so you'd reuse thread from garments beyond saving. Needles were treasured possessions, sometimes borrowed between neighbours. The skill of invisible mending was highly valued because visible patches announced poverty, and people had some pride left even when they had nothing else. And through all of this, the layering, the dampness, the smell, the constant disintegration, you were expected to show up at the factory looking presentable enough not to get fined for slovenliness. Some foremen would enforce dress codes, penalising workers whose clothing was too ragged. It was a cruel irony. You couldn't afford decent clothes because of low wages, but you could have your already low wages docked for not having decent clothes. Welcome to Victorian fashion, where the only style was survival, and the only trend was trying not to freeze to death while maintaining enough dignity to avoid fines. Waking up in an industrial Manchester lodging house during winter was like emerging from a coma directly into an Arctic expedition. Your breath formed clouds in the air, your clothes had frozen stiff overnight, and you had approximately 7 minutes to get dressed and out the door before your shift started and you lost your job. The first challenge was actually waking up. There were no alarm clocks for people who couldn't afford food, let alone timekeeping devices. You relied on your internal clock, which had been traumatized into submission by months of pre-dawn wake-ups, or you depended on the knocker-upper, a person employed to tap on windows with a long pole to wake workers. Yes, this was a real job. Someone's entire livelihood was walking through dark streets at 4:30 a.m., hitting windows with a stick. The Industrial Revolution created some truly inspiring career opportunities. The moment consciousness returned, you faced an immediate crisis, leaving the marginal warmth of your bedding to face the frigid air. Your body, which had finally achieved some level of tolerable temperature after hours of shivering itself to sleep, knew this was a terrible idea and resisted accordingly. Every muscle screamed at you to stay put. Your brain tried to convince you that maybe the factory would understand if you were late just this once. Spoiler, they wouldn't. So you forced yourself to move, throwing off the frozen blanket in one quick motion like ripping off a Band-Aid, except the Band-Aid is the only thing keeping you from hypothermia. The shock of cold air hitting your body was immediate and total. Within seconds, you went from uncomfortably cold to legitimately concerned about dying. Your skin prickled with goosebumps so aggressive they could probably be classified as a defensive mechanism. You gasped, and your lungs filled with air cold enough to hurt. This was your morning wake-up call, courtesy of Victorian climate control, which is to say, no climate control whatsoever. Finding your clothes in the dark was an adventure. There was no gaslighting in your room, that cost money, so you fumbled around by whatever moonlight or streetlight managed to penetrate your grimy window. Your clothes were wherever you'd dropped them the night before, which was usually on the floor or draped over the foot of the bed. In winter, these clothes had frozen into strange sculptural shapes, like textile origami designed by someone who hated you. Your shirt was stiff as a board, your trousers could stand up on their own. It's like your clothes had achieved sentience and decided to rebel against their purpose. Getting dressed meant a series of terrible decisions. Do you try to warm your clothes against your body first, or just force your frozen limbs into frozen fabric and hope mutual suffering generates heat? Most workers chose the latter because time was critical, and also warming clothes against your skin just meant you became cold faster, while the clothes stayed mostly frozen. So you shoved your arms into sleeves that felt like ice tubes, pulled on trousers that crackled with frost, and tried not to think about how this was your life now. Buttoning anything with numb fingers was a special kind of torture. Your hands didn't want to cooperate, your fingers wouldn't bend properly, and the buttons were small, frozen, and absolutely determined to make you late. You'd fumble with them, drop them, curse quietly so you didn't wake your bedmates who were somehow still sleeping through this nightmare, and eventually just give up on the bottom buttons and hope your coat covered the gap. Presentability was less important than not freezing and not getting fired, in that order. Layering happened fast and inefficiently. Every shirt you owned went on. Waistcoat, jacket, coat. You were building a textile fortress around your body, hoping sheer volume would accomplish what quality couldn't. By the time you were fully dressed, you'd gained about 30 pounds in clothing weight and lost most of your range of motion. Bending down to put on boots was a full-body engineering challenge. Your torso couldn't fold properly with 7 layers of fabric, so you developed this awkward squat-lean maneuver that would make a yoga instructor cry. Boots were their own special hell. They'd frozen overnight, the leather stiff and unyielding. Shoving your foot into a frozen boot while standing in a freezing room, while wearing multiple layers of trousers and socks, required the determination of someone who really needed to not lose their job. The boot wouldn't give, your foot wouldn't cooperate. You'd hop around on one leg trying to force the issue, probably disturbing everyone else in the room, and definitely questioning your life choices. Eventually, through sheer force and possibly some quiet sobbing, your foot would go in. Then you'd repeat the process with the other boot, and by the end you were sweating despite the cold, which meant you'd now be wet under your layers. Fantastic. There was no time for breakfast. Some workers would grab a piece of stale bread or a cold potato left from the night before, shoving it in their pocket to eat on the walk. Most just left on an empty stomach because food was either gone or would take time to prepare, and time was the one thing you absolutely didn't have. Your body would protest this decision loudly around hour 6 of your shift. But that was a problem for future you. Present you just needed to not be late. Personal hygiene was aspirational. Washing your face meant finding water that hadn't frozen solid, which was already unlikely. If you were extraordinarily lucky and had somehow maintained liquid water, you'd splash it on your face, a shocking, painful experience that woke you up more effectively than any coffee. But most mornings the water bucket was a solid block of ice, so you just wiped your face with your hand and called it good enough. Your teeth? Forget it. Dental care was something you'd think about never, because you had neither the time nor the resources for it. Your breath was probably terrible, but so was everyone else's, creating a collective mouth odour that pervaded the factory like a fog. Using the toilet was another race against time. The communal privy in the courtyard was already occupied because 40 other people had the same morning schedule, so you'd wait in the freezing dark, hopping from foot to foot, trying not to think about your full bladder while your body temperature dropped by the second. When you finally got your turn, you'd rush through the experience, which wasn't difficult because the privy was so cold and unpleasant that lingering was impossible. The smell, the cold seat, the knowledge that you were sitting where dozens of strangers had sat, it all encouraged efficiency. Hair was handled with maximum speed and minimum care. Women would twist their hair into tight buns, secure them with whatever pins or strips of fabric they had, and cover everything with a shawl or cap. The goal wasn't style, it was keeping hair out of machinery and preventing it from freezing into icicles during the walk to work. Men would run their fingers through their hair, maybe splash it with water if any was available, and call it done. Victorian hair care was minimalist by necessity, not choice. By now you'd been awake for maybe 5 or 6 minutes, and it was time to leave. No sitting down to gather yourself. No gentle transition into the day. No moment of calm before the storm. You grabbed whatever you needed, coat already on, maybe a cloth bag with your lunch if you had one, your factory identification if required, and headed for the door. The other people in your room were doing the same chaotic dance, everyone rushing, bumping into each other, muttering apologies or curses depending on their temperament and how close to late they were. The hallway was pandemonium. Dozens of workers from different rooms all converging on the narrow staircase at once, creating a human traffic jam in the dark. You couldn't see properly, so you just followed the movement of the crowd, hoping not to trip on the broken stairs or collide with someone coming from a different direction. The air was thick with the combined breath of desperate workers, creating a fog that made visibility even worse. It's like a very cold, very stressful music festival, except instead of music there's just anxiety, and instead of festival vibes there's the crushing weight of capitalism. Out on the street the pre-dawn darkness was absolute. Gas streetlights were rare in working-class neighbourhoods. Those cost money to maintain and illuminate, so you navigated by memory and luck. The cobblestones were slick with ice. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe, and you could see nothing beyond vague shapes of buildings and the forms of other workers shuffling toward the factories. Everyone moved in the same direction, a silent army of the exhausted all racing against their shift start time. The cold outside was somehow different from the cold inside. It was sharper, wetter, more aggressive. The wind cut through your layers like they were tissue paper, finding every gap in your clothing and exploiting it mercilessly. Your ears ached immediately. Your nose began to run, and you had nothing to wipe it with except your sleeve, which was already frozen. Your eyes watered from the cold wind, and the tears would freeze on your cheeks if you weren't careful. Walking faster helped generate body heat, but also made you breathe harder, filling your lungs with painful cold air. The walk could be anywhere from 10 minutes to an hour, depending on where your lodging house was in relation to your factory. Every step was a negotiation between speed and safety. Walking fast meant risking slips on ice. Walking slow meant definitely being late. You learned to do this shuffle walk, a rapid but careful gait that kept you moving while minimizing the chance of falling and breaking something essential for factory work, like your skull or your ability to stand. Around you, other workers emerged from other lodging houses, swelling the ranks of the pre-dawn march. Nobody talked much. It was too cold, too early, and everyone was conserving energy for the 14-hour shift ahead. Occasionally you'd hear coughing, the chronic wet cough of tuberculosis or the dry hack of someone whose lungs were giving up after years of cotton dust. The morning commute became a symphony of human respiratory distress, punctuated by the sound of boots on cobblestones and the distant factory bells beginning to ring. Those bells were your nemesis and your guide. They marked the time, warned you of how many minutes you had left, created urgency where exhaustion wanted rest. The first bell might ring at 5:30, giving you 30 minutes warning, the second at 5:45, giving you 15. The final bell at 6 meant the doors were closing, and if you weren't inside, you were unemployed. The bells didn't care that you were cold, tired, hungry, or that your boots had holes and your feet were wet. They just rang, mechanical and indifferent, marking time you didn't have. By the time you reached the factory gates, you were simultaneously freezing and sweating, exhausted and wired with adrenaline, hungry and nauseous. Your morning routine was complete. You'd successfully transitioned from frozen sleep to frozen wakefulness in under 10 minutes, gotten dressed in the dark, navigated a death trap staircase, walked through Arctic conditions, and arrived just in time to spend the next 14 hours operating dangerous machinery while underfed and sleep-deprived. Congratulations, you survived another morning. Now do it again tomorrow, and the day after, and every day for the rest of your short, cold, miserable life. Welcome to the morning routine in industrial Manchester, where every day started with frostbite and ended with exhaustion, and the only reliable constant was that tomorrow would be exactly the same. If you were lucky enough to eat breakfast before your shift, it consisted of whatever you could afford and prepare in the dark while your fingers were still too frozen to function properly. We're talking about watery porridge, stale bread, tea so weak it was basically hot regret, and occasionally a piece of bacon that had seen better decades. The reality was that most factory workers skipped breakfast entirely, not by choice, but because eating required food, and food required money, and money was something you had in theoretical amounts but not in actual breakfast purchasing quantities. Your wages barely covered rent and the absolute minimum of food to prevent starvation, which meant breakfast was an optional luxury like happiness or feeling your toes. For those who did manage breakfast, the process started with the fundamental challenge of having a heat source. Most lodging house rooms had no fireplace, no stove, nothing that could cook food or heat water. If you were extremely lucky, your lodging house had a communal kitchen, a room with a single fire where dozens of people competed for cooking space. This meant waking up even earlier to claim your spot, fighting off other desperate workers, and hoping no one stole your food while you weren't looking. It's like Black Friday shopping, except the sale item is the ability to not starve. Porridge was the breakfast of champions, and by champions I mean people who had given up on joy. Oats were relatively cheap, they filled your stomach, and they provided enough energy to not immediately collapse at your workstation. The preparation was simple. Mix oats with water, heat if possible, eat while trying not to think about it. Milk was too expensive for daily use, so your porridge was made with water, creating a grey, gluey substance that had the consistency of wallpaper paste and approximately the same flavour profile. The porridge would be cooked the night before if you had the foresight and energy, left to congeal overnight, then reheated in the morning if heating was possible. More often, you'd eat it cold, straight from the pot, while standing in your freezing room, trying to choke down enough to give you fuel for the day. Cold porridge has the texture of library paste mixed with sadness. Each spoonful was an act of will, a negotiation between your survival instinct and your gag reflex. Bread was the other staple, and I use the term bread loosely. What you could afford was the cheapest, coarsest bread available, made from rye, barley or wheat flour mixed with whatever filler the baker thought he could get away with. Sawdust, chalk, alum and other creative additives were common. The bread would be stale by the time you bought it because fresh bread cost more, and stale bread was all you could manage. By breakfast time, this bread had achieved a hardness that could probably be used as a building material. Eating stale bread required strategy. You couldn't just bite into it. You'd break your teeth, which you couldn't afford to fix, so you'd be toothless, and that would make eating everything else difficult. Instead, you'd dunk the bread in whatever liquid you had. Weak tea, water, or your watery porridge, softening it just enough to become edible without causing dental damage. The result was a soggy, barely flavoured mush that tasted like wet cardboard that had been left in a basement. Delicious. Tea was theoretically available but practically a joke. Real tea was expensive, so what workers drank was tea that had been used before and sold as second-hand tea, or tea that was mostly dust and stems, or tea that was cut with other dried leaves that may or may not have been from actual tea plants. You'd use the smallest amount possible, reusing the same leaves multiple times until they gave up all pretense of flavour and were just providing coloured hot water. The result was a pale brown liquid that was warm and vaguely tea-adjacent. It was better than cold water, which was the only real standard it had to meet. Making tea required boiling water, which required fire, which circled back to the whole no heat source problem. If you had access to a fire, you'd boil enough water to make tea that you could drink throughout the day, storing it in a bottle or flask. If you didn't have fire access, you drank cold water and told yourself it was refreshing, which it wasn't. Some workers would stop by street vendors on their way to work, buying a cup of hot tea for a halfpenny, which was money you couldn't afford but warmth you desperately needed. Sugar was a fantasy. Honey was a myth. You drank your terrible tea unsweetened because sweeteners cost money and also weren't really necessary when the tea itself barely tasted like anything. Some workers would save their sugar rations for weeks to have one properly sweetened cup of tea, making it an event, a moment of actual pleasure in a life otherwise devoid of such moments. Then they'd go back to their usual brown water and remember what happiness tasted like, which was arguably worse than never knowing. Butter, jam, anything that might make bread more palatable, forget it. Those were luxuries for people who weren't living paycheck to paycheck while the paycheck was insulting. You ate dry bread or bread soaked in tea water, and you were grateful because the alternative was no bread at all. Sometimes you'd have drippings, the fat left over from cooking meat, if you'd had meat recently, which you hadn't. These congealed fats could be spread on bread, adding calories and a flavour that can best be described as extremely animal. On special occasions, maybe once a week if you were doing better than most, you might have an egg. One egg, boiled if you could manage it, fried if you had access to a pan and some kind of fat. This egg was treasure. You'd eat it slowly, savouring every bite, because you knew it would be days before you had another one. Protein was rare and precious, and your body craved it desperately after months of subsisting primarily on grain and sadness. Bacon appeared in working-class breakfast about as often as unicorns appeared in meadows. When it did exist, it was the cheapest, fattiest cuts, heavily salted for preservation, possibly rancid, definitely not the artisanal farm-to-table experience modern brunch-goers expect. You'd cook a tiny piece, maybe the size of your thumb, and try to make it last by savouring each greasy, salty bite. Or you'd cook it with your porridge, letting the fat flavour the oats, creating a breakfast that was marginally less depressing. The quantities were as important as the quality, which is to say, insufficient. A bowl of watery porridge, a slice of stale bread, some weak tea, that's maybe 300 or 400 calories if you're generous. You were about to work 14 hours of physically demanding labour in a cold environment. Your body needed 3,000 plus calories to sustain that. The math didn't work, which is why factory workers were chronically malnourished, underweight, and constantly exhausted. You were running a marathon on the fuel appropriate for a light walk, and your body knew it and hated you for it. Children's breakfast was even more depressing. They got smaller portions because they were smaller humans, but they needed calories for growth in addition to the energy for their 14-hour factory shifts. Many children worked on empty stomachs entirely because family resources prioritized the adult wage earners. A child might get a piece of bread and nothing else, then be expected to operate machinery and stay alert for safety. The combination of hunger and exhaustion is why child factory workers had such high accident rates. They were literally running on empty. For families, breakfast was a triage situation. Who needed food most urgently? The primary breadwinner got priority because they absolutely couldn't afford to lose that income. Then other working family members, then children, then the elderly or non-working family members. It wasn't cruelty, it was brutal pragmatism. If the main earner couldn't work due to lack of energy, the entire family starved, so they ate first and ate most. Everyone else got leftovers, which was often nothing. The speed of breakfast was dictated by time pressure. You couldn't leisurely enjoy your meal because you had 7 minutes before you needed to leave. So you'd shovel food into your mouth, burning your tongue on porridge that was somehow both lukewarm and scalding, choking down bread that hadn't fully softened, gulping tea that was too hot but you didn't have time to let it cool. Digestion would happen on the walk to work. And your stomach would protest loudly, but that was a problem for later. Some workers would prepare breakfast the night before, cutting bread, portioning porridge, doing whatever prep was possible when they had slightly more time and energy. This meant eating food that was even more stale and cold, but it saved precious morning minutes. It's meal prepping, except instead of Instagram-worthy containers, it's wrapping a piece of bread in a rag and hoping it doesn't get mouldy overnight. The psychological impact of starting every day hungry cannot be overstated. You woke up hungry because you went to bed hungry. You'd eat an inadequate breakfast and remain hungry. You'd work all morning hungry. Hunger became your baseline state, a constant background noise to your existence. Your body stopped sending urgent hunger signals because there was no point. Food wasn't coming regardless of how much your stomach complained. You learned to ignore the hollow ache, the weakness, the way your hands shook slightly from low blood sugar. Street vendors sometimes sold breakfast foods to workers on their morning commute. Meat pies, hot potatoes, fried fish, bread rolls. These smelled amazing and cost money you absolutely shouldn't spend, but sometimes did anyway because hunger is persuasive, and the smell of hot food when you're freezing and starving overrides financial common sense. You'd spend a penny or two, eat something warm and almost satisfying, and then regret it later when you couldn't afford dinner. It was borrowing from your future self to give your present self one moment of not being miserable. Coffee existed but was even more expensive than tea and not yet the working class drink it would become later. Some workers drank coffee substitutes made from roasted chicory, barley or other grains. These tasted nothing like coffee but were hot and dark and vaguely coffee adjacent, which was close enough. You'd drink them and pretend they were providing the energy boost coffee was famous for, when really they were just giving you warm flavoured water and hope, which is basically what coffee is anyway when you think about it. Seasonal variation in breakfast was minimal because you couldn't afford variety. Porridge in winter, porridge in summer, bread year-round. The only thing that changed was whether you could eat it cold or had the access to heat to warm it slightly. Fresh fruit. That was for rich people and the very brief periods when something was in season and cheap enough to afford, which meant maybe a few weeks per year you'd have an apple or some berries. The rest of the time, fruit was a fond memory or a distant concept. The social aspect of breakfast was non-existent. You weren't gathering around a table with family, having pleasant morning conversation. You were standing in a cold room, possibly in the dark, shoving food into your face as quickly as possible, while multiple people did the same thing around you. No one spoke because there was no time and nothing to say. The only sounds were chewing, swallowing, and the occasional cough or sigh of resignation. And then it was over. You'd consumed maybe a quarter of the calories you needed, none of the nutrients your body craved. And it was time to leave for your shift. Your breakfast wouldn't sustain you until lunch, but there was no snacking allowed at the factory, so you'd just be hungry. Again. Still. Always. Welcome to breakfast in industrial Manchester, where the most important meal of the day was important primarily because it reminded you that you were poor, hungry, and about to spend 14 hours making someone else rich while your stomach ate itself. Bon appétit. Walking to the factory in industrial Manchester wasn't a pleasant morning stroll. It was a journey through thick smog that turned day into perpetual twilight, past streets running with industrial waste and human sewage, dodging coal carts and navigating cobblestones slick with ice and substances you didn't want to identify. The first thing that hit you when you stepped outside was the air. And hit is the operative word, because the air in industrial Manchester had physical presence. It wasn't just something you breathed, it was something you wore, tasted, and occasionally choked on. The smog was thick enough to see, a yellow-brown fog that hung at street level like a malevolent cloud that had given up on the sky. In winter, when every factory and home burned coal for heat and power, the air quality went from terrible to potentially lethal. You couldn't see more than 20 feet ahead on bad days, which was most days. The smog obscured buildings, turned streetlights into fuzzy halos, and made navigating by sight nearly impossible. You learned your route by memory and counting steps, like a very polluted orienteering exercise. Other workers emerged from the fog like ghosts, materializing suddenly beside you, then disappearing back into the murk. It was atmospheric in the most literal and depressing sense. The smell was indescribable, but I'll try anyway because someone should document exactly how terrible it was. Coal smoke formed the base note, that sharp, acrid smell of burning fossil fuels that coated your throat and made you cough. On top of that, chemical smells from the factories, sulphur, chlorine, ammonia, and various mystery compounds that modern chemistry probably has names for, but Victorian workers just called the stink. Add in human waste from inadequate sewage systems, animal waste from the horses that pulled carts, rotting garbage from streets that were rarely cleaned, and the collective unwashed smell of thousands of humans. And you had an olfactory experience that would make a skunk apologise. Breathing this air was like inhaling a science experiment designed by someone who hated humanity. Each breath burned slightly, coating your lungs with coal dust and industrial particulates. You'd develop Manchester cough, a chronic respiratory condition so common it was named after the city. Everyone coughed. Everyone! It was the soundtrack to the morning commute. Hundreds of workers hacking their way to work trying to expel the pollution they couldn't stop inhaling. Your spit would turn black from the coal dust. Your handkerchief, if you owned one, would be permanently stained dark from wiping your nose and mouth. The streets themselves were obstacle courses. Cobblestones, when they existed, were uneven and slippery. Many working-class neighbourhoods had unpaved streets, just mud, frozen solid in winter, creating a surface with the traction of an ice rink. You walked carefully, testing each step because falling meant arriving at work injured, wet, and possibly covered in whatever filth you'd fallen into. And there was always filth. Open sewers ran along many streets, channels of human waste that were supposed to drain away, but mostly just sat there, freezing in winter and creating toxic ice formations. In the dim light of pre-dawn, you couldn't see these channels clearly, so stepping in them was a regular occurrence. The sensation of your foot sinking into frozen sewage is something that stays with you, psychologically if not physically, though often physically too because that wasn't coming out of your boot without significant effort. Industrial waste added to the street hazards. Factories would dump their refuse directly into streets, textile dyes, chemical runoff, metal shavings, anything they didn't want. This created a toxic soup that mixed with the human waste and rain to form puddles of truly horrifying composition. These puddles would have colours not found in nature, bright blues, deep purples, yellow greens, announcing their chemical contents like warning signs that no one could read and everyone ignored out of necessity. The traffic was dangerous despite the early hour. Coal carts rumbled through the streets, heavy wagons loaded with fuel for the factory's insatiable appetites. The drivers were in a hurry, had limited visibility in the smog and frankly didn't care much about pedestrian safety. You'd hear the rumble of wheels on cobblestones and the clip-clop of horse hooves, then scramble to get out of the way before several tons of coal cart flattened you. There were no traffic lights, no crosswalks, no pedestrian right-of-way, just you versus a horse-drawn vehicle, and the horse was winning. Horses added their own contribution to street conditions. Horse manure was everywhere, piled in the streets, ground into the cobblestones, frozen into icy lumps. In winter, these lumps became ice mines, hard, irregular obstacles you could trip over or slip on. The horses also died sometimes right there in the street from overwork or cold, or because horses aren't immortal. The carcasses would be left for days before removal, creating temporary landmarks. Turn left at the dead horse was probably actual directions people gave. Street vendors appeared in the pre-dawn darkness, setting up their carts to catch workers on their way to factories. They sold hot tea, bread, pies, and other quick foods. The smell of these foods was tantalizing when you were hungry, which you were, but stopping meant risking being late, and being late meant losing your job. You'd walk past, stomach growling, trying not to think about how good that hot pie smelled compared to the cold bread in your pocket. Some vendors would call out to you, advertising their wares, competing with the sounds of coughing workers and rumbling carts. Other workers joined the stream gradually. Individual workers from individual lodging houses merged into small groups, then larger crowds, all flowing in the same direction like a human river toward the factories. By the time you got closer to the factory district, hundreds of people were walking together, a silent army of the exhausted. The sound was remarkable. Hundreds of boots on cobblestones, creating a rhythmic clatter, punctuated by coughs, the occasional conversation, and factory bells in the distance. The cold made everything worse. Your breath froze on your scarf or collar, creating a stiff, icy patch against your face. Your eyelashes collected ice if it was cold enough. Your nose ran constantly, and wiping it with a frozen hand wearing no gloves was an exercise in futility. The pollution stuck to the moisture on your face, creating a grimy layer that you couldn't wipe away without water and a cloth, neither of which you had. By the time you reached the factory, your face would be coated in a mixture of soot, ice crystals, and industrial fallout. You looked like you'd aged a decade during a 15-minute walk. The factories themselves created localized weather patterns. The heat they generated would rise, meet the cold air, and create thick steam clouds that added to the smog. These clouds would roll through streets near factory districts, adding moisture to the already polluted air, and creating a fog-smog hybrid that was somehow worse than either component alone. Visibility would drop to near zero, and you'd navigate by following the person in front of you, hoping they knew where they were going, all of you like a chain of very cold, very blind factory workers. Buildings along your route were blackened with soot. Everything was black. The bricks, the windows, the doors. It's like someone had painted the entire city with coal dust, which essentially they had continuously via air pollution. You couldn't tell what the original colour of buildings had been. Everything was uniformly dark, creating a visual monotony that matched the spiritual monotony of your existence. Even new buildings turned black within months of construction. The sound environment was constantly hostile. Factory whistles and bells rang out, marking time, calling workers, announcing shifts. These weren't gentle reminders. They were loud, harsh, designed to be heard over factory machinery, which meant they were absolutely deafening on the street. You'd wince every time a whistle blew, your ears ringing, your head pounding, but there was no escape. The bells controlled your life, dictated your schedule, and reminded you constantly that time was passing, and you had places to be. Street children appeared occasionally, some on their way to their own factory shifts, others begging, still others engaged in petty crime. These children looked like miniature adults, their faces already aged by hardship, their bodies already showing signs of malnutrition and overwork. Some would call out asking for pennies or bread. Most workers ignored them because helping meant using resources you didn't have, and also because there were too many to help. The scale of poverty made individual charity feel meaningless, so people hardened themselves and kept walking. Rats were everywhere, moving along the edges of buildings, slipping through garbage piles, occasionally running across your path. They were fat and confident because in industrial Manchester rats ate better than workers. They had unlimited access to garbage, grain storage, and the contents of sewers. Some were the size of cats, moving with a casual arrogance that suggested they knew they were winning the evolutionary game. You learned not to react to them because reacting meant acknowledging them, and acknowledging them meant accepting that you shared your city with millions of well-fed rodents. The closer you got to the factory district, the more crowded the streets became. Hundreds of workers from dozens of lodging houses, all converging on the same area, created a bottleneck effect. You'd be shoulder to shoulder with strangers, moving slowly, pressed close enough to smell their unwashed bodies, and feel their body heat, which was actually welcome in the cold. The crowd had its own momentum carrying you forward whether you wanted to go or not. If you tripped, you'd probably be trampled, so you stayed upright through sheer survival instinct. Some commutes were longer than others. If you lived in cheaper lodging further from the factory district, you might walk for an hour or more. Each way, that's 2 hours of walking daily through pollution and cold, before and after your 14-hour shift. By the time you reached your workplace, you'd already expended significant energy, frozen several body parts, and probably shortened your lifespan by several days just from the air quality. And you hadn't even started your actual job yet. The factory gates appeared through the smog like the entrance to another world, which they were, a world of machinery, noise, and danger. As you approached, the stream of workers would accelerate, everyone trying to make sure they got through before the final bell. Being caught outside when that bell rang meant unemployment, so the last 50 meters became a race, workers speeding up despite exhaustion, slipping on ice, bumping into each other, all desperately trying to clock in on time. When you finally passed through the factory gates, you'd pause for just a moment, catching your breath, your lungs burning from the cold and pollution, your body aching from the walk. You'd made it. You survived another commute. Now you just had to survive the next 14 hours of work, then do the entire commute again in reverse, in the dark, even more exhausted. Welcome to the daily journey in industrial Manchester, where getting to work was almost as dangerous as the work itself, and the air quality was approximately equivalent to smoking a pack of cigarettes, while someone spray-painted your lungs black. But hey, at least you weren't late. One of the most disturbing aspects of factory life was that children, some as young as 5 or 6 years old, worked alongside adults. Factory owners loved child labour because children were cheaper to pay, easier to bully, and their small hands could reach into dangerous machinery that adults couldn't access. It was exploitation dressed up as opportunity. The Victorian justification for child labour was a masterpiece of twisted logic. Factory owners and their defenders argued that working in factories saved children from idleness and moral corruption. They claimed factory work built character, taught discipline, and provided poor families with necessary income. It was framed as charity, as if giving a 7-year-old a 14-hour shift operating dangerous machinery was an act of benevolence rather than what it actually was: legal child abuse with a profit motive. Children were recruited young, often before they could read, write, or understand what they were agreeing to. Parents, desperate for any additional income, would bring their children to factory gates like they were enrolling them in school, except this school had no recess. The lessons were, don't get your arm ripped off by machinery, and graduation meant either growing up or dying, whichever came first. Some children were orphans sent by workhouses to factories as cheap labour under the pretense of apprenticeship. These apprentices were essentially indentured servants, bound to factories for years, fed minimally, housed terribly, and worked constantly. The pay for child workers was insulting even by the standards of insulting wages. A child might earn 2 to 3 shillings per week, roughly a fifth of what an adult man earned for the same hours. The factory owner's logic was simple. Children are smaller, therefore they're worth less. Never mind that the work was equally exhausting, equally dangerous, and equally necessary for production. Children were paid in pocket change and told to be grateful for the opportunity to contribute to their family's survival and the nation's economic progress. The jobs children performed were specifically designed to exploit their size and vulnerability. One common role was scavenger, children who crawled under operating machinery to collect loose cotton fibres while the machines were still running. Imagine being 6 years old, squeezing under a spinning frame where hundreds of moving parts could catch your hair, clothing, or body, trying to grab bits of cotton from the floor, while the machine roared above you like a mechanical monster. The risk of being crushed, caught, or scalped was constant. Children died regularly in these positions, and the factory response was typically to clean up the body and hire another child. Pieces were slightly older children, maybe 8 to 12, whose job was to reconnect broken threads on spinning frames. This required quick, precise hand movements around machinery that had no safety guards and no sympathy for small fingers. The work demanded intense concentration for 14 hours, straight from children whose brains weren't developed enough for sustained focus, When tired children made mistakes, they lost fingers. Lost fingers meant they couldn't work as effectively, which meant lower wages or termination. It was a system designed to consume children and discard them when they broke. The physical impact on child workers was devastating and permanent. Children's bodies were still growing, their bones still developing, and forcing them into repetitive motions and unnatural postures for 14 hours daily created lifelong deformities. Child factory workers often developed twisted spines from bending over machines, bowed legs from standing on hard floors, and stunted growth from malnutrition and lack of sleep. By age 12, factory children looked decades older than their actual age, their bodies already showing the wear patterns of adults twice their age. Education was effectively impossible for factory children. Even after laws were passed requiring some minimal schooling, the reality was that children were too exhausted to learn anything. They'd arrive at their brief school sessions after already working 6 hours, sit in a cold room with no energy, try to stay awake while a teacher droned about letters and numbers that seemed irrelevant to their immediate reality of not dying in machinery. Then return to the factory for another 8 hours. Literacy remained a distant dream for most factory children. They learned to read profit margins and production quotas instead of books. The psychological damage was equally severe but less visible. Children who should have been playing, exploring, developing social skills and imagination were instead learning that life was suffering, that authority figures would hurt them, and that their value was measured only in productivity. They developed a kind of premature adulthood, losing childhood entirely to become small, efficient production units. Some became withdrawn and listless. Others became cruel, bullying younger children because cruelty was the only power they had. All of them learned too early that the world was neither fair nor kind. Discipline in factories was brutal for everyone, but especially for children. Overseers believed children needed firmer handling to maintain productivity, which translated to hitting them with straps, throwing things at them when they dozed off, and verbally abusing them constantly. A child who worked too slowly might be beaten. A child who made a mistake might be docked pay. A child who complained about anything might be dismissed, condemning their entire family to greater poverty. Fear was the primary management tool, and it was applied generously to the smallest, most vulnerable workers. Accidents involving children were horrifyingly common. The combination of dangerous machinery, exhaustion, small bodies, and inexperience created perfect conditions for tragedy. Children would fall asleep standing up and topple into machinery. They'd misjudge distances and get caught in belts. They'd be too weak to escape dangerous situations that adults might avoid. The injury rate for child workers was significantly higher than for adults. Yet factory owners continued employing them because even with the occasional lost child, they were still cheaper than adult labour. The injuries themselves were nightmare-inducing, scalping from hair caught in machinery. Crushed hands from trying to clear jammed equipment, amputated fingers from piecing too close to moving parts, broken bones from falls, burns from steam or hot metal, and these children had no workers' compensation, no medical care beyond what their families could afford, which was nothing, and no legal recourse. An injured child was simply an unemployed child, often left permanently disabled with no way to earn money ever again. Some children didn't make it home. They'd die in accidents, collapse from exhaustion, or succumb to the diseases that thrived in crowded, unsanitary factory conditions. Their deaths were barely recorded. A note in a ledger, maybe a brief mention in a local newspaper if the accident was particularly spectacular, and then nothing. The factory would hire a replacement the next day. Children were interchangeable parts in the industrial machine, their individual identities irrelevant to the system that consumed them. The sleep deprivation alone was enough to cause serious developmental problems. Children need more sleep than adults. Their growing bodies and brains require rest to develop properly. Factory children got maybe 6 hours of sleep if they were lucky, often in the terrible conditions already described. Chronic sleep deprivation in children causes cognitive impairment, behavioural problems, weakened immune systems, and stunted physical growth. Victorian factory children were essentially being slowly destroyed by the combined effects of overwork, underfeeding, pollution exposure, and sleep denial. Families faced an impossible choice: send their children to work and watch them suffer, or keep them home and watch the entire family starve. It wasn't really a choice at all. Parents who loved their children still sent them into factories because there was no alternative. The guilt must have been crushing, but survival overrode everything else. Some parents tried to protect their children by taking the worst jobs themselves, but when collective family income still wasn't enough, children had to work regardless. The justifications offered by factory owners and their supporters were staggeringly cynical. They claimed children were naturally suited to certain tasks, as if evolution had designed 6-year-olds specifically to crawl under spinning frames. They argued that factory work was better than the alternatives: crime, prostitution, starvation, conveniently ignoring that those alternatives existed because of the same economic system that required child labour. They insisted that children themselves wanted to work, as if a child choosing between work and watching their siblings starve was a meaningful choice. Reform movements eventually emerged, horrified citizens and activists who investigated factories and published reports detailing the conditions. These reports shocked the public with descriptions of children working barefoot in freezing factories, falling asleep at their machines, bearing scars from beatings and injuries. The Factory Acts gradually improved conditions, limiting children's working hours to a mere 12 per day, requiring minimal schooling, raising the minimum working age to a generous 9 years old. These reforms were fought tooth and nail by factory owners who insisted that limiting child labour would destroy British industry and impoverish the very families it was meant to help. Even with reforms, enforcement was minimal. Factory inspectors were few, easily bribed and often sympathetic to owners rather than workers. Children's ages were frequently lied about. Birth certificates weren't mandatory or universal, so a 9-year-old could be claimed as 13 and no one could prove otherwise. Sick or injured children would be hidden when inspectors visited. The minimal schooling requirements were satisfied by providing the bare minimum: a cold room, no books, a teacher with no training, and calling it education. The long-term effects on survivors were profound. Children who lived through factory work often carried physical and psychological scars for life. They had missing fingers, chronic respiratory problems, permanent skeletal deformities, and trauma that manifested in various ways. Many became parents themselves and faced the same impossible choice their parents had: send their own children into factories or watch them starve. The cycle continued, generation after generation, until reforms gradually made the worst abuses illegal. What's perhaps most disturbing is how normal this all seemed to Victorian society. Child labour wasn't a scandal hidden from public view. It was openly practised, legally protected, and economically celebrated. Walking past a factory window and seeing dozens of small children operating machinery wasn't shocking. It was just how things were. The moral blindness required to see child exploitation as acceptable, even beneficial, reveals something dark about how economic systems can normalise atrocities when those atrocities are profitable. The children themselves had no voice, no power, no advocates beyond a few reformers who were dismissed as sentimental troublemakers interfering with progress. These children endured day after day, year after year, their childhood stolen, their bodies broken, their potential destroyed, all to produce textiles that wealthy people would wear without ever thinking about the small scarred hands that made them. Welcome to child labour in industrial Manchester, where opportunity meant the opportunity to be exploited. Education meant learning how not to die in machinery, and childhood was a luxury exclusively for people who weren't poor. Every factory had a foreman, and his job was to make sure you worked hard enough to justify your starvation wages, while not working so hard that you died before the end of your shift and created paperwork. These men ruled their floors like medieval lords, wielding the power to fire, fine, or make your life even more miserable than it already was. The foreman was essentially a worker who'd been promoted into management, given a tiny bit more pay and absolute authority over everyone beneath him, which was everyone on the factory floor. It's like being handed a kingdom, except the kingdom is 100 exhausted, desperate workers, and your royal duty is to extract maximum productivity while maintaining minimum humanity. Some foremen remembered their own days as regular workers and showed mercy. Most did not. Power corrupts, and even tiny amounts of power in desperate environments corrupt spectacularly. The foreman's appearance announced his status. While regular workers wore the same clothes every day until they rotted, the foreman had a slightly better coat, maybe a waistcoat without too many visible patches, possibly even a pocket watch, though it was probably tin, not gold. He didn't operate machinery himself. Instead, he walked the floor, watching, judging, occasionally barking orders, always holding a ledger where he recorded productivity, mistakes, and reasons for fines. That ledger was his weapon, more powerful than any physical tool because it controlled your wages and therefore your survival. His management style was based on fear, intimidation, and the constant threat of unemployment. There were always more workers desperate for jobs, and he made sure you knew it. Fall behind on production, he'd remind you that 10 people would love your position. Make a mistake, that's a fine deducted from your already pathetic wages. Talk back, you're fired, get out, we'll have your replacement before lunch. The power dynamic was absolute. He could destroy your life with a word and you had zero recourse. The foreman carried a stick. Sometimes it was a cane, sometimes just a wooden rod, occasionally a leather strap. This wasn't a fashion accessory, it was a motivational tool. Workers who slowed down might get a sharp rap on the shoulders or back. Children who dozed off got whacked awake. Anyone who showed the slightest defiance would be reminded physically of their place in the hierarchy. This was completely legal and socially acceptable. Factory discipline included corporal punishment, and the foreman was the chief disciplinarian, judge, and executioner of small violences. His morning routine set the tone for the day. He'd arrive before the workers, inspect the machinery, review yesterday's production numbers, and plan today's expectations. When workers filed in, he'd watch them with the intensity of a predator evaluating prey. Who looked too tired? Who seemed sick? Who was limping from an injury? These observations would determine who got pushed harder, who got assigned the worst tasks, and who might be let go if their productivity slipped. There was no sympathy for human frailty. Weakness meant liability, and liabilities were eliminated. The quota system was his primary management tool. Each worker had production quotas, numbers they had to hit daily, weekly, monthly. These quotas were set not by what was humanly sustainable, but by what maximum productivity looked like on the best possible day, then increased by 10%, because surely workers could always do more. Failing to meet quota meant fines. Repeatedly failing meant termination. The quotas ignored illness, exhaustion, equipment malfunctions, or any other excuse. Numbers were numbers, and numbers didn't care about your children being sick or your hands being too cold to work properly. Breaks were at the foreman's discretion, which meant they were rare and grudging. The legally mandated meal breaks had to be observed, but bathroom breaks, personal emergencies, moments to catch your breath. Those were granted as favours, not rights, and accepting these favours meant owing the foreman something: faster work, acceptance of a worse task, silence about safety violations. Everything became transactional. Your basic human needs were negotiating chips in a game where the foreman held all the cards. Sexual harassment was rampant and essentially unpunishable when it came from foremen. Women and girls working in factories faced constant inappropriate comments, unwanted touching, and demands for sexual favours in exchange for better assignments or not being fined into starvation. Refusing a foreman's advances could mean losing your job, being assigned to the most dangerous equipment, or having your wages docked for invented infractions. Reporting this behaviour was pointless. Factory owners didn't care, police didn't care, and society believed that women in factories were already morally suspect anyway. The foreman's favourites got slightly less terrible treatment. These were usually the fastest workers, the ones who never complained, the ones who'd inform on fellow workers. Creating a class of informants within the workforce was brilliant management strategy. It meant workers couldn't organise, couldn't plan resistance, couldn't even vent frustrations without risk of it getting back to authority. Trust between workers was eroded systematically, making collective action nearly impossible. It's the divide and conquer strategy applied to factory management, and it worked beautifully for the owners. Fines were the foreman's most creative weapon. The list of finable offences was extensive and arbitrary. Arriving late? Fine. Your machine breaking down? Fine. Talking during work? Fine. Looking tired? That's fine too, literally. Not standing up straight? Fine. Taking too long in the privy? Fine. The creativity was impressive. Foremen could find reasons to fine anyone for anything, effectively controlling wages by deciding how much workers would actually take home. Some weeks, after fines, workers might earn almost nothing despite working full hours. The foreman's relationship with factory owners was complicated. He was their representative on the floor, expected to maximize productivity and minimize complaints. But he was also expendable. If production fell, he'd be replaced. If worker unrest grew too loud, he'd be sacrificed to calm things down. His slightly elevated position was constantly precarious, which made him even more tyrannical. He ruled harshly because he feared being demoted back into the ranks of regular workers, a fall he'd do anything to avoid. Some foremen were sadistic, genuinely seeming to enjoy the suffering they inflicted. They'd smile while hitting workers, laugh while issuing fines, take visible pleasure in firing someone who begged to keep their job. These men had found their calling as small-time tyrants, wielding their limited power with the enthusiasm of emperors. Other foremen seemed dead inside, mechanically enforcing rules without emotion, their humanity eroded by years of being the intermediary between desperate workers and greedy owners. Neither type was better, different flavors of the same misery. The foreman controlled more than just work. He controlled access to the few positives in factory life. Need a day off for a family emergency? Ask the foreman and hope he's feeling generous. Want a slightly safer workstation? Better be in the foreman's good graces. Need your wages paid on time instead of delayed? The foreman processes those payments, and if he doesn't like you, there might be administrative delays. Every aspect of factory life ran through this one man's approval, making him simultaneously the most hated and most feared person in workers' daily existence. His enforcement of safety regulations, when they existed, was selective at best. Safety measures cost time and money, reducing productivity. So foremen would often ignore or actively discourage safety practices. Machinery guards slowed down production? Remove them. Workers taking time to do things safely? Pressure them to work faster, unsafely. If accidents happened, well, that was the workers' fault for being careless, not the foreman's fault for creating dangerous conditions. The foreman would be the first to blame injured workers for their own injuries, protecting himself and the factory from responsibility. The foreman's communication style was exclusively aggressive. He didn't ask, he demanded. He didn't explain, he ordered. His vocabulary consisted largely of faster, move, work, and various curses. Actual conversation was beneath him. Workers weren't people with thoughts and feelings. They were production units that occasionally malfunctioned and needed verbal correction. This dehumanization wasn't accidental. It was necessary for the job. Seeing workers as fully human would make the cruelty harder to inflict. Promotions from worker to foreman were rare but strategically used by factory owners. Occasionally, a particularly productive or compliant worker would be elevated, shown off as proof that hard work was rewarded, that the system was fair. In reality, these promotions were calculated to give false hope, to make workers believe that if they just worked hard enough, they too could escape the bottom tier. Most workers would never be promoted no matter how hard they worked, but the possibility kept them compliant, kept them competing against each other rather than organising together. The foreman's home life, ironically, probably wasn't much better than the workers he oppressed. His slightly higher wages still placed him firmly in the working poor. He went home to similar lodging houses, similar terrible food, similar cold rooms. The main difference was the psychological burden of being complicit in others' suffering. Some foremen drank heavily to cope with this. Others became increasingly bitter and cruel, and a few eventually broke down entirely, unable to reconcile their actions with their conscience. But these were rare exceptions. Most just continued enforcing the brutal system because not doing so meant joining the ranks of those they oppressed. The workers' relationship with their foreman was complex and toxic. They hated him, but also needed his approval. They feared him, but also occasionally pitied him, recognizing that he too was trapped in the system, just one level higher. Some workers tried to ingratiate themselves, becoming sycophants who might curry favour. Others maintained cold distance, doing exactly what was required and nothing more. A few actively defied him when possible. small acts of resistance that provided momentary satisfaction before the inevitable punishment. When unions eventually began organising in factories, the foreman became the front line of anti-union enforcement. He'd identify suspected union sympathisers and fire them. He'd plant informants in worker groups to report on organising activities. He'd threaten workers with blacklisting if they attended union meetings. Factory owners relied on foremen to crush organising efforts before they gained momentum, and foremen complied because their jobs depended on maintaining the owner's control. It was class warfare, with the foreman as a traitor to his own class, a worker turned against workers. The foreman's legacy in labour history is as the face of oppression for thousands of workers. When people remember Industrial Revolution horrors, they often remember the foreman, his stick, his ledger, his arbitrary power, his casual cruelty. He wasn't the system's architect, but he was its most visible enforcer, the daily reminder that workers had no dignity, no rights, no value beyond their productivity. He was both villain and victim, oppressor and oppressed, hated and pitiable. In the end, the foreman was a symptom of a larger disease, an economic system that required someone to enforce its brutal logic on the factory floor. Remove one cruel foreman, and another would take his place because the cruelty wasn't personal, it was structural. The job required crushing human spirit to maintain profit margins, and someone would always be willing to do it for slightly better wages and a tiny taste of power. Welcome to life under the foreman in industrial Manchester, where your immediate boss was also your warden, judge, and sometimes executioner. And the only guarantee was that showing weakness meant suffering consequences. Lunch wasn't a relaxing hour where you stepped out to a nice cafe. It was 15 minutes if you were lucky, during which you tried to eat whatever cold food you'd brought from home while standing up, because sitting down meant your body might realise how exhausted it was and refuse to get back up. The lunch bell rang at exactly noon, and you had two choices: race to eat or race to use the privy. You couldn't do both. There wasn't time. So you made strategic decisions based on which bodily need was more urgent, knowing that whichever you didn't address would torment you for the next 6 hours until your shift ended. It's like Sophie's Choice, but with bathroom breaks and sandwiches, and somehow just as devastating in the moment. Your lunch, such as it was, had been with you since morning. You'd carried it in a cloth bag or wrapped in newspaper, tucked into your coat pocket or tied to your belt. By lunchtime, it had absorbed the ambient temperature of the factory, meaning it was cold in winter and warm in a concerning way in summer. Whatever you'd packed that morning had spent hours marinating in factory air, absorbing coal dust, textile fibres, and the general atmosphere of industrial despair. The typical lunch was depressingly simple. Bread, maybe some cheese if you'd had a good week, occasionally a cold potato or turnip, and if fortune truly smiled upon you, a small piece of salted meat. This wasn't cuisine. It was fuel, barely. The bread was the same stale, rock-hard stuff from breakfast, now even staler from hours of exposure. You'd bite into it and your jaw would ache from the effort. Chewing became a workout, your teeth grinding against bread that had the consistency of building materials. There was nowhere nice to eat. No break rooms, no cafeteria, no pleasant spaces designated for human rest. You ate wherever you could find space, leaning against your machine, sitting on the floor, standing in corners, crouched in stairwells. Some factories had designated eating areas, which sounds civilized until you realize these were just cleared floor spaces where dozens of workers crammed together, eating in a standing room-only crowd that smelled like collective body odour and industrial chemicals. It's communal dining, if communal dining was designed as punishment. The noise didn't stop during lunch. The machines were shut down, yes, which meant the deafening roar reduced to a more tolerable level of general industrial clamour. But you could still hear other machinery from other parts of the factory, the hiss of steam, the shouts of workers, the clanging of metal, and the ringing in your ears from 6 hours of noise exposure. Conversation was possible but difficult. You had to shout to be heard, which took energy you didn't have, so most people just ate in silence. The speed of eating was critical. 15 minutes sounds like enough time until you account for all the subtasks. Unwrapping your food, 30 seconds. Finding a place to stand or sit, another 30 seconds. Actually eating while your hands are still shaking from machinery vibration and your throat is raw from breathing factory air. The remaining 14 minutes. which is not enough. You'd shovel food into your mouth, barely chewing, your body desperate for calories and not particularly concerned with the dining experience. Water was supposed to be available, but the quality was questionable and the access was competitive. Factories might have a few water pumps or barrels scattered around, serving hundreds of workers. During the lunch break, these water sources would be surrounded by crowds, everyone trying to get a drink in their allotted 15 minutes. The water itself was lukewarm at best, often contaminated with rust from pipes, or just generally questionable, but you drank it anyway because you were dehydrated from hours of work and you needed something to wash down that brick-like bread. Some workers brought weak tea in bottles, cold now but still preferable to water of unknown origin. The tea would have a layer of floating debris by lunchtime, cork particles from the bottle stopper, textile dust from the factory air, possibly small insects that had crawled in. You'd try not to look too closely, just drink it fast and tell yourself it was all extra protein. Mindfulness about what you were consuming was a luxury. You drank what you had and hoped your stomach was resilient enough to handle it. The social dynamics of lunch were complex. Some workers used this time to gossip, share news, complain about foremen, or just connect with fellow humans. Others were too exhausted for socializing and just wanted to eat and rest in silence. Friendships formed around shared lunch spots. You'd gravitate toward the same area each day, creating informal territories. These tiny social structures gave some sense of normalcy to an otherwise dehumanizing existence. At least you had your corner, your group, your 15 minutes of almost being treated like a person. But lunch break also highlighted the inequalities within the working class itself. Some workers had slightly better food, maybe actual meat or fresh vegetables or multiple pieces of bread. This wasn't because they were rich, they just had slightly less dire circumstances. Maybe both parents worked, or they had fewer children, or they'd been lucky recently. But their better lunches created visible class divisions even among the poor. You'd see someone eating something marginally more substantial and feel a pang of jealousy, resentment and self-pity all at once. Children during lunch break were particularly heartbreaking. Their small hands would unwrap even smaller portions of food, a single thin slice of bread, maybe nothing at all. Some children shared lunches with adult relatives who worked in the same factory, taking turns biting from the same piece of bread. Others would watch other workers eat, their eyes following every morsel, their own stomachs empty because family resources had been allocated elsewhere. Hungry children trying to stay alert for another 6 hours of dangerous machinery work. The mathematics of that situation didn't work, and everyone knew it. The 15-minute limit was enforced with the same rigor as shift start times. Foremen would walk around with pocket watches counting down the minutes. At 14 minutes, they'd start shouting warnings. At 15 minutes exactly, the machinery roared back to life whether you'd finished eating or not. If you were mid-bite, tough luck. Wrap it up and save it for later, except there was no later until the end of your shift, hours away. Workers would cram final bites into their mouths, choking slightly, rushing to swallow before having to return to their stations. Some workers skipped lunch entirely, using those 50 minutes to sleep instead. They'd find a corner, sit down with their back against a wall, and immediately pass out from exhaustion. 15 minutes of sleep wasn't enough to actually restore energy, but it was better than nothing. These workers would wake up even more disoriented and hungry, but for them, the brief escape from consciousness was worth the sacrifice of food. It's a calculation that says everything about how desperate and exhausted people were, choosing sleep over food because both were in such short supply that you couldn't have adequate amounts of either. The privy situation during lunch was its own special nightmare. Remember, this was your only real opportunity to use the toilet during your shift. The facilities, already terrible, became completely overwhelmed during the 15-minute lunch break. Lines of desperate workers formed outside the privies, each person dancing in place, trying to wait their turn while the clock ticked down. Some people would spend their entire lunch break standing in line for the toilet, never getting to eat at all. Others would give up waiting, hold it for another 6 hours, and suffer the medical consequences. Hygiene during lunch was non-existent. Your hands were filthy from 6 hours of factory work, covered in machine oil, textile dust, coal residue, and whatever else you'd been handling. There were no hand-washing facilities for workers, Some factories had hand pumps, but they were for machinery cooling, not human cleanliness. So you ate with dirty hands because you had no choice. Every meal came with a side of whatever industrial grime you'd accumulated, adding an extra texture and probably some heavy metal poisoning to your already questionable food. The emotional toll of lunch breaks was significant. For 15 minutes, you'd stop moving, and your body would start to register everything that hurt: your feet, your back, your hands, your head. The constant distraction of a work would pause, and you'd become aware of your exhaustion. Your hunger that wasn't satisfied by your meagre lunch, your aching muscles, your general misery. Some workers said that lunch break was harder than working because during work you could mentally check out, but during lunch you were forced to confront your own suffering. It's like a daily moment of unwanted mindfulness about how terrible your life was. Weather affected lunch breaks dramatically. In winter, stopping work meant immediately getting colder. Your body heat would drop, your sweat-dampened clothes would freeze against your skin, and your cold lunch would make you even colder. Eating ice-cold food in a freezing factory while trying to recover energy for the afternoon shift was a test of will. In summer, the opposite happened. Stopping work meant becoming more aware of the oppressive heat, your overheated body, your dehydration, and your lunch food that might have been spoiling in your pocket all morning. The afternoon shift after lunch was always harder than the morning. Your body had tasted rest, however brief, and didn't want to start up again. Your blood sugar would spike slightly from eating, then crash within an hour, leaving you even more exhausted than before lunch. Your stomach would cramp from eating too fast or from eating food that was marginally spoiled, and psychologically, knowing you'd used your one break and still had 6 or more hours to go was crushing. The afternoon stretched ahead like an eternity, made worse by having glimpsed a moment of respite. Some factories didn't even provide 15 minutes. Some gave 10 minutes, or even less. Some would allow a lunch break but make it unpaid, docking your wages for that time, which created an impossible choice: eat and earn less, or skip eating and risk collapsing from malnutrition. And enforcement was arbitrary. Foremen might cut lunch short if they decided production was behind schedule, or extend it slightly if they were in a rare good mood, which they never were. Your lunch break length could vary by 5 minutes day to day, adding an element of uncertainty to an already stressful situation. The crumbs from lunch would stay with you all afternoon. They'd be in your pockets, stuck to your clothes, ground into the factory floor. Small reminders of the meal that wasn't enough, the break that was too short, the 15 minutes that simultaneously saved you and tortured you by showing how desperately you needed rest you weren't getting. Some workers developed a kind of Pavlovian response to lunch bells, relief at the break, but also dread at how fast it would end and how inadequate it would be. Looking around during lunch break, you'd see the entire hierarchy of suffering. Workers in their prime, struggling but managing. Older workers, barely holding on, eating mechanically without any sign of enjoyment. Children, too young to be there, trying to eat with hands that trembled from exhaustion. Women, managing their own hunger while often sharing food with children or elderly family members working in the same factory. Everyone united in the common experience of insufficient rest, inadequate food, and the ticking clock counting down to the moment they'd have to resume work. And then, like clockwork, brutal clockwork, the 15 minutes would end. The bell would ring. The machines would roar back to life, and you'd wrap up whatever food remained, shove it back in your pocket for a dinner that was hours away, and return to your station. Your stomach was still half empty. Your body was still exhausted. Your break had solved nothing except delaying your collapse by a few hours. Welcome to lunch break in industrial Manchester, where the meal break was designed to keep you alive just long enough to continue generating profit, and the only thing guaranteed was that it would never, ever be enough. Let's talk about what happened when nature called during your 14-hour shift. Factory toilets, if they existed at all, were communal, filthy, and located in places that suggested the architect actively hated humanity. Privacy was non-existent, hygiene was aspirational, and the smell was something that violated several laws of physics. First, understand that factory toilets weren't designed for worker comfort. They were designed to minimize the time workers spent not working. The philosophy was clear. Biological functions are unfortunate interruptions to productivity, and facilities should be just barely adequate to prevent workers from soiling themselves at their stations, which would damage the textiles. That was the bar. Not dignity, not comfort, not basic sanitation. Just, please don't ruin the products with your bodily functions. The typical factory privy was a wooden structure, either inside the factory building or in the courtyard outside, containing a bench with holes cut into it positioned over a pit. That's it. That's the technology. Multiple holes, meaning multiple people could use the facility simultaneously, sitting shoulder to shoulder, experiencing one of humanity's most private moments in a group setting. It's like a committee meeting, except everyone's vulnerable and no one wants to be there. The number of toilets was criminally inadequate. A factory employing 300 workers might have 4 or 5 toilet holes. Do the math. During the brief lunch break when everyone needed to go, the lines stretched around corners. During work hours, you'd need permission from the foreman to leave your station, which he'd grant grudgingly, making clear that your biological needs were inconvenient and suspicious. Some foremen would only allow toilet breaks at specific times, treating bladder control as a sign of character and moral worth. The smell hit you from 20 feet away. It wasn't just unpleasant, it was aggressive, a physical presence that assaulted your senses and made your eyes water. The pits beneath the toilet holes were rarely emptied, sometimes going months between cleanings. They'd fill up, overflow slightly and continue being used because what else were people supposed to do? The combination of human waste, industrial chemicals that workers had been exposed to, and whatever mysterious substances came out of factory worker digestive systems created an olfactory experience that defied description. There were no doors on individual stalls because there were no stalls. Just a long bench with holes, completely open, offering zero privacy. You'd sit next to co-workers, strangers, possibly your supervisor, all handling your business while pretending not to notice each other. Eye contact was avoided. Conversation was impossible and undesirable. You developed a 1,000-yard stare, looking at nothing, thinking about nothing, just trying to finish quickly and escape. Toilet paper didn't exist in factory privies. Workers brought their own materials if they had them. Scraps of newspaper, rags, old fabric pieces. The newspaper was particularly popular because it was cheap and plentiful, though the ink would transfer to your skin, leaving you with backwards text on your anatomy. Some workers just used their hands and wiped them on their clothes because they didn't have anything else. Hygiene standards were best you can manage under impossible circumstances. The ventilation was either non-existent or actively counterproductive. Interior privies had small windows or vents that did nothing to disperse the smell. They just allowed it to circulate throughout that section of the factory, creating dead zones where the air was visibly thicker. Outdoor privies were better in theory. At least the smell could dissipate into open air. But in winter, using an outdoor privy meant exposing yourself to freezing temperatures while in a vulnerable position, which created its own circle of misery. The pits beneath the toilets were supposed to be regularly emptied by night soil men, workers whose job was to shovel human waste out of pits and cart it away. This happened irregularly at best. The factory owners didn't want to pay for frequent cleaning, and workers couldn't demand better conditions. So the pits would fill until they were nearly overflowing, creating situations where using the toilet meant risking splashback from the accumulated waste below. It's every bathroom anxiety nightmare made real and mandatory. Women had additional challenges. Victorian sensibilities meant women were supposed to maintain modesty, even while using facilities designed to prevent any possibility of modesty. Women's clothing, long skirts, multiple layers, made using these open toilets even more difficult and embarrassing. They had to manage their garments while sitting on filthy benches next to other people, maintaining some semblance of propriety in circumstances that made propriety impossible. And menstruation? That was handled with rags that had to be managed, hidden, and cleaned somehow, all without adequate facilities or privacy. The toilet bench itself was a health hazard. Multiple people sitting on the same wooden surface throughout the day, with no cleaning between uses, meant disease transmission was almost guaranteed. Splinters were common. The wood would rot from constant exposure to moisture and waste. Sitting on these benches meant accepting that you were making direct contact with surfaces that dozens of diseased, unwashed people had sat on hours or minutes before. There were no seat covers, no sanitary barriers, just raw wood that had absorbed years of various substances. Getting permission to use the toilet was its own ordeal. You'd have to catch the foreman's attention, gesture or shout your need over the machinery noise, and wait for permission. He might make you wait just to assert dominance, or deny permission if he decided you'd been already that day. Some foremen tracked toilet visits, implementing informal limits. More than 2 or 3 trips during a shift and you'd be accused of shirking work, fined or disciplined. Your bladder's schedule had to align with your foreman's generosity, which it often didn't. The time pressure was intense. You weren't given a specific time limit, but the expectation was clear. Handle your business and return immediately. The foreman was timing you mentally, and taking too long meant consequences. This meant you'd rush through everything, barely taking time to properly manage your clothing or clean yourself. Speed was survival. Thoroughness was a luxury that could cost you wages or your job. Illness made everything worse. If you had dysentery, cholera, or any of the many digestive diseases that plagued factory workers, you'd need frequent toilet access. But the foreman didn't care about your medical condition. Repeated bathroom requests were seen as weakness or shirking, not illness. Workers would try to hide illness, avoiding the toilet until absolutely necessary, which led to accidents, which led to humiliation and often termination. Being sick enough to need frequent bathroom access meant you couldn't work, and not being able to work meant unemployment and starvation. The winter situation was particularly brutal for outdoor privies. The bench would be covered in frost or ice. The pit below would partially freeze, though not enough to make it less disgusting, just enough to make it more uncomfortable. Your exposed skin would stick slightly to the frozen wood. The cold would make everything take longer because your body didn't want to cooperate in freezing temperatures. Some workers developed chronic urinary problems from holding it rather than facing the frozen privy, which led to infections and kidney problems that they couldn't afford to treat. Children using these facilities was especially heartbreaking. Young workers, some not even 10 years old, trying to manage adult-sized toilet holes, sitting on benches where their feet didn't touch the ground, surrounded by adult co-workers, with no help or accommodation for their size or age. Some children were too small to safely use the toilets and would risk falling in. The fear of falling into the pit below was legitimate and traumatizing. Some children would wet themselves rather than face the privy, leading to punishment and humiliation. The diseases spread through these facilities were numerous and predictable. Cholera outbreaks started in privies. Typhoid thrived in the conditions. Dysentery was so common it was barely noteworthy. Any intestinal parasite or infection found a perfect transmission point in shared toilet facilities with no hygiene. Workers would get sick from the privy, need to use it more due to illness, spread the disease to others, and create a beautiful cycle of disease transmission that factory owners blamed on workers' dirty habits, rather than the facilities they provided. Some workers tried to avoid factory toilets entirely, using them only when absolutely necessary. They'd develop impressive bladder control, training themselves to last entire shifts without access. This wasn't healthy. Chronic urine retention can cause serious medical problems, but it was preferable to the toilet experience. Others would try to time their bathroom needs for breaks or the walk home, planning their bodily functions around their work schedule like military operations. The smell of the privies would cling to you after use. Your clothes would absorb the odour, mixing with the smells you'd already accumulated from factory work. By the end of a shift, distinguishing between different sources of stench was impossible. You just smelled comprehensively bad. The privy smell added another layer to your personal bouquet of despair. Co-workers could tell if you'd just used the facilities, creating an additional element of embarrassment to an already humiliating experience. Graffiti covered the walls of many privies, carved or written by workers across years. These weren't elaborate artworks. They were desperate messages, crude drawings, names and dates, profanities directed at foremen and factory owners. The privy walls became one of the few places where workers could express themselves without immediate supervision. It was anonymous, crude communication between people who shared the same suffering. Future workers would read messages from past workers, creating a weird temporal connection through the medium of toilet graffiti. The cleanup, or lack thereof, was another issue. When pits were finally emptied, the job was given to the lowest paid workers available, often recent immigrants or people so desperate they'd accept any job. These night soil workers would shovel out accumulated waste, often without any protective equipment, breathing the fumes, getting it on their clothes and skin. They'd haul it away in carts, usually at night to minimise public offence, dumping it in rivers or nearby areas where it would continue causing health problems for different communities. Factory owners occasionally made improvements to toilet facilities, not out of concern for workers, but because of regulatory pressure or bad publicity. They'd add a few more holes, maybe repaint the structure, and then point to these improvements as evidence of their benevolence. The improvements never addressed the fundamental problems: inadequate numbers, lack of privacy, poor maintenance, no hygiene provisions. They were cosmetic changes to a system that needed complete overhaul. Some factories had no toilets at all. Workers were expected to use public facilities outside the factory gates, meaning leaving the factory entirely, which wasn't allowed during work hours. These workers had to hold it their entire shift or risk termination for abandoning their station. The health consequences were severe: chronic urinary retention, kidney problems, bladder infections, all preventable with adequate facilities, but prevention required spending money on worker welfare, which violated the fundamental principles of industrial capitalism. The psychological impact of having no control over basic bodily functions cannot be overstated. Adults, denied permission to use toilets, treated like children who couldn't be trusted, forced to beg for the right to relieve themselves. It was dehumanizing by design. The message was clear. Your body belongs to your employer during work hours. Your biological needs are inconvenient obstacles to production. Your dignity is optional and expensive, and factories don't do optional or expensive. The toilet situation became a rallying point for labour reformers. Investigators would document the conditions, writing shocked reports about the indecency and health hazards. These reports would shame some factory owners into minor improvements and lead to regulations requiring minimum toilet facilities per worker. But enforcement was lax, and many factories continued operating with inadequate facilities for decades, paying occasional fines that were cheaper than actually solving the problem. Workers developed dark humour about the privies, because dark humour was the only response that made sense. Jokes about the smell, the lack of privacy, the form and timing your bathroom breaks. This humour was a coping mechanism, a way to assert some control over a situation that stripped you of all control. If you couldn't change it, at least you could laugh bitterly about it while sitting shoulder to shoulder with strangers over a pit of horror. Welcome to the toilet situation in industrial Manchester, where answering nature's call required permission, courage, and a strong stomach. Where privacy was fiction, hygiene was fantasy, and your most basic human biological functions were treated as inconvenient disruptions to profit. Where the facilities provided were deliberately inadequate because adequacy would cost money and reduce productivity by precious seconds. It was inhumane by design, and everyone knew it. And it continued anyway because workers' dignity had no market value. Factory accidents weren't rare, unfortunate events. They were regular occurrences. Lose a finger in the machinery? That's Tuesday. Burn from boiling water or chemicals? Wednesday. The factory owner might express concern, but only about how quickly you could be replaced, not about implementing safety measures to prevent the next injury. The statistics, when anyone bothered to collect them, were horrifying. In some Manchester factories, 1 in every 20 workers was injured seriously enough to miss work each year. And those were just the serious injuries, the ones involving missing body parts, broken bones, or burns severe enough to prevent working. Minor injuries like crushed fingers, deep cuts, scalding and machinery-caused bruises happened daily, and were so common they weren't even recorded. You just wrapped them up and kept working because stopping meant losing wages you couldn't afford to lose. The machinery was designed without any safety considerations. There were no guards around moving parts, no emergency shut-offs within reach, no shields protecting workers from spinning wheels or exposed gears. Everything that moved was accessible, and everything that was accessible eventually caught someone. Belts whipping overhead, gears grinding at waist height, spinning frames with hundreds of moving parts. It was an obstacle course designed to maim, and you worked in it 14 hours a day while exhausted, malnourished, and distracted by the constant pressure to maintain productivity. The most common injury was to hands and fingers. Your hands were your tools, constantly reaching into dangerous spaces to tie threads, clear jams, adjust machinery. The spinning frames didn't care if your finger was in the way when they rotated. The power looms didn't pause for your hand positioning. You'd be working fast because you had to work fast, and you'd misjudge a distance by half an inch. The machine would catch your finger, and before your brain even registered what happened, that finger would be crushed, severed, or mangled beyond repair. The sound was distinctive. A crunch followed by your scream, followed by the indifferent roar of machinery continuing as if nothing had happened. Losing a finger didn't get you sympathy. It got you fired. If you couldn't perform your job with 9 fingers or 8 or 7, you were unemployable in that role. Some workers would wrap injured hands and try to continue working, hiding the severity of their injury because admitting they couldn't work meant unemployment. They'd work through the pain, the bleeding, the infection setting in, desperately hoping the hand would heal enough to be functional. Sometimes it did. More often, infection would spread. The hand would be lost entirely, and the worker would be dismissed anyway, now with a permanent disability and no means of support. Scalping was another regular occurrence, particularly for women and children with long hair. Despite warnings about keeping hair tied back, loose strands would escape, get caught in moving machinery, and then the machine would do what machines do, pull. In an instant, a woman's hair would be yanked into a belt or spinning frame, and her scalp would come with it. The screaming would stop the nearby workers, but not the machines. Someone would have to shut down equipment manually, while the victim bled profusely from their head. Many victims survived scalping, but they were left permanently disfigured, usually unemployable and often psychologically destroyed. Burns were constant in any factory using steam power or hot water. Steam pipes would leak or burst without warning, spraying superheated steam that would cook flesh instantly. Workers in dyeing sections handled vats of boiling liquid and caustic chemicals that could splash, spill, or be accidentally knocked over. The burns ranged from painful to catastrophic. Severe burns often became infected in an era before antibiotics, and infection often meant death, just slower and more agonizing than the initial burn itself. And the factory response? Clean up the mess, replace the worker, continue production. Clothing getting caught in machinery was a death sentence scenario. A loose sleeve, a trailing apron string, a coat corner, anything could catch in moving parts. Once caught, you'd be pulled in with terrifying speed. The machinery was strong enough to lift your entire body, bend you at unnatural angles, crush bones and tear flesh. Some workers were killed instantly, their bodies pulverized by mechanical forces. Others died slowly, trapped in machinery that couldn't be shut off quickly enough, crushed slowly while co-workers and foremen tried desperately to reverse the equipment. It was a horror show, and every worker had either seen it happen or knew someone who had. Falling was another major hazard. Factories had multiple floors connected by rickety staircases, ladders, and sometimes just holes with ropes. Workers climbing to different levels, often carrying heavy loads, would slip, miss a step, or grab a rotten railing. Falls from height often meant broken bones at best, spinal injuries and death at worst, and there were no railings on many platforms, no safety harnesses, no catch systems. You just had to not fall, and if you did fall, that was your fault for being clumsy. The factory would dock your final wages to cover the cost of cleaning up your blood. The immediate response to accidents was telling. If a worker was injured, the first priority was clearing them away from the machinery so production could resume. Their medical needs came second to keeping the factory running. Injured workers would be dragged or carried to a corner, given minimal first aid if any, and expected to either recover enough to keep working or leave. There were no factory nurses, no emergency medical teams, no ambulances. Your co-workers might help bandage you with whatever cloth was available, but that was the extent of medical care on site. Transportation to actual medical help was the worker's responsibility. If you could walk, you walked to a doctor, though most workers couldn't afford doctors. If you couldn't walk, you hoped a co-worker would help you home or to a charity hospital. Some injured workers would lie in factory corners for hours, occasionally for days because no one wanted to take responsibility for them, and they couldn't move themselves. A few died from treatable injuries simply because they couldn't access care, and no one thought their life was worth the trouble of arranging transportation. Compensation for injuries was a fantasy. There was no workers' compensation insurance, no legal requirement for factories to pay for injuries sustained on their premises. If you were injured at work, you absorbed all the costs: lost wages, medical expenses, ongoing care, and the loss of future earning capacity if you were permanently disabled. The factory owner's attitude was clear: you chose to work here, accidents are your responsibility, and we owe you nothing beyond your last day's wages. This created a beautiful situation where workers who were maimed while generating profit for owners were left destitute while those owners continued getting rich. Some accidents were spectacular enough to make local newspapers: a machine exploding and killing multiple workers, a building collapse, a fire that trapped dozens. These got coverage. The reports would express shock, maybe call for reforms, and then everyone would move on. The smaller daily accidents, the individual finger crushed here, the scalp torn there, the burn victim who died of infection 3 weeks later, these were invisible, not newsworthy. Just the cost of doing business, accounted for in the same ledger as machinery depreciation and raw material costs. The psychological trauma of working around constant accidents was severe. You'd see co-workers maimed, hear their screams, watch blood spray across machinery, and then be expected to return to your station and continue working as if nothing happened. You couldn't process the trauma because there was no time and no support. You just shoved it down, added it to the pile of psychological damage you were accumulating, and kept working because stopping meant starvation. Some workers developed what we'd now recognise as PTSD, hypervigilance, nightmares, flashbacks, panic attacks when near certain types of machinery. But Victorian factory owners just called these workers nervous and fired them for low productivity. Children suffered disproportionately in accidents because their small bodies and developing brains made them more vulnerable. A machine that might injure an adult could kill a child, and children were assigned the most dangerous tasks: crawling under moving machinery, operating equipment they could barely reach, working in positions that left no escape route if something went wrong. When children were injured, the moral outrage was slightly higher, but not enough to change anything. Parents grieving their maimed or dead children still had to work the next day because grief doesn't pay rent. The long-term effects of injuries shaped lives and communities. A man who lost his hand at 30 would be unemployable for the rest of his life in an economy that had no place for disabled workers. His family would sink into deeper poverty. His children would have to work younger to compensate for his lost income. His wife might have to take in laundry or turn to prostitution to keep everyone fed. One factory accident rippled through entire families and across generations, creating cascading misery that factory owners never saw and never cared about. Some injuries were invisible but equally devastating. Constant exposure to cotton dust caused brown lung disease, a chronic respiratory condition that would slowly suffocate workers over years. Chemical exposure caused various cancers, organ failures, and chronic illnesses that wouldn't manifest until years after the exposure. These slow-motion accidents were never attributed to factory work officially, even though everyone knew the connection. Workers just mysteriously got sick and died in their 40s and 50s, and factories claimed no responsibility because proving causation was impossible without modern medical science and epidemiology. The culture around accidents was one of victim blaming. If you were injured, it was because you were careless, inattentive, or incompetent. Never mind that you'd been working 14 hours straight on minimal food and sleep. Never mind that the machinery had no safety features. Never mind that you'd been pressured to work faster than was safe. The narrative was always that the worker failed, not that the system was designed to produce injuries. This gaslighting was effective. Many injured workers genuinely believed their accidents were their own fault, carrying guilt along with their physical injuries. Factory inspectors, when they existed, were a joke. They'd show up announced, giving factories time to hide the worst violations. They'd take reports from owners, not workers. They'd see obvious hazards and recommend improvements that were never made. And even when they documented dangerous conditions, the penalties for violations were minimal. Small fines that were cheaper to pay than implementing safety measures. The inspection system was performative oversight designed to look like regulation while changing nothing. Some workers tried to organise for safety improvements, but these efforts were crushed. Demanding safety guards on machinery? That's troublemaking. Asking for slower production speeds to reduce accidents? That's attacking the factory's competitiveness. Requesting protective equipment? That's an unreasonable expense. Workers who pushed for safety were labelled agitators, fired, and blacklisted. The message was clear: accept the danger or starve. Most chose to accept the danger because the alternative wasn't really an alternative at all. The equipment maintenance, or lack thereof, made accidents worse. Machinery was run until it literally broke because maintenance was expensive, and stopping production was worse. This meant workers operated equipment with worn parts, loose connections, and developing faults that made accidents more likely. That grinding noise your machine made? Probably fine. That wobble in the spinning frame? Don't worry about it. That belt that's visibly fraying? Keep working, we'll replace it when it snaps. And when it did snap, whoever was nearby would be injured, and the factory would express surprise that anyone could have predicted this completely predictable outcome. The first aid available in factories was primitive and often dangerous. Wounds would be bandaged with dirty rags. Burns would be treated with whatever oil or grease was handy, often making them worse. Broken bones might be set by whoever felt confident enough to try, usually creating permanent deformities. The workers providing this first aid had no medical training. They were just co-workers doing their best with no resources. Some remedies were actively harmful, based on folk medicine and superstition rather than actual medical knowledge. But it was all anyone had, so it's what they used. The grief process for families of workers killed in accidents was complicated by economic desperation. You couldn't take time to properly mourn your child, spouse, or parent who'd been crushed by machinery yesterday because you had to work today, or your family would starve tomorrow. Funerals were rushed, cheaper fares because that's all anyone could afford. Graves were often unmarked because headstones cost money. The dead were mourned quickly and then somewhat forgotten because dwelling on tragedy was a luxury. You had to keep moving, keep working, keep surviving, and adding another death to your mental burden wouldn't help anyone pay rent. Welcome to accident culture in industrial Manchester, where losing body parts was routine, medical care was your own problem, compensation was non-existent. And every day you walked into the factory was a gamble with your physical integrity. Where the machinery that made you money was also the machinery that might kill you, and the factory owners calculated that replacing injured workers was cheaper than preventing injuries in the first place. Where your life had been reduced to a cost-benefit analysis, and you'd already lost. So, you've survived. Congratulations. You made it through a single day as a factory worker in industrial Manchester, which statistically speaking puts you ahead of quite a few people who didn't. You've frozen in rooms that were somehow colder inside than outside. You've shared beds with strangers and their comprehensive collection of parasites. You've eaten food that barely qualified as edible. You've walked through air thick enough to chew. You've worked 14 hours operating machinery designed by people who'd never heard the phrase worker safety and wouldn't have cared if they had. You've used toilet facilities that violated the Geneva Convention before the Geneva Convention existed. And you've done all of this for wages that wouldn't buy you dignity even if dignity were for sale, which it wasn't, because the market for dignity had crashed somewhere around the invention of the power loom. But here's what's remarkable, what's genuinely awe-inspiring about the people who lived through this. They survived it. Not just physically, though that alone was an achievement worthy of medals that were never awarded. They survived it spiritually, emotionally, communally. They found ways to laugh in lodging houses that smelled like collective despair. They shared their inadequate food with neighbours who were equally starving. They protected each other's children when they could. They organised, slowly and dangerously, to demand better conditions. They maintained their humanity in a system specifically designed to strip it away and replace it with pure economic function. They were stubborn in the most beautiful way possible, refusing to be completely broken by circumstances that should have broken them. These weren't exceptional people in the sense that they had superhuman abilities. They were ordinary humans facing extraordinary cruelty, and they endured because the alternative was giving up, and giving up meant death. They got up every morning in the freezing dark because their families needed them. They operated dangerous machinery while exhausted because unemployment meant starvation. They lived in conditions we'd consider torture because there were no other options available. And through all of it, the cold, the hunger, the exhaustion, the constant threat of injury or death, they maintained small acts of resistance. A joke shared with a co-worker, a moment of kindness in a cruel world, a determination that their children might somehow have it slightly better. The world they lived in doesn't exist anymore, at least not in Manchester, at least not in quite the same way. The reforms they fought for, often dying in the process, eventually came. Child labour laws, maximum working hours, safety regulations, workers' compensation, the weekend, sick days. All the things we take for granted now were won by people who couldn't afford to take anything for granted. Every 8-hour workday, every safety guard on machinery, every building code requiring adequate exits and ventilation, every labour law protecting workers from exploitation. All of it was paid for by the suffering and sacrifice of factory workers who never got to benefit from the changes they helped create. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep in your heated home, in your own bed, with indoor plumbing and clean water and access to medical care and more food than you need, and air you can breathe without coughing, maybe spare a thought for them. The factory workers of industrial Manchester who lived lives we can barely imagine now, who survived conditions that would break most of us within days, who worked themselves into early graves so that the modern world could be built on their broken bodies and unrewarded labour. They deserve to be remembered not as victims, though they were victimised, but as survivors, as people who faced the worst of the Industrial Revolution and somehow made it through to the other side, even if that other side came too late for most of them to see. History isn't just kings and wars and great men making great decisions. Sometimes, often, history is ordinary people enduring extraordinary misery with quiet courage, creating small moments of humanity in inhumane circumstances, and refusing to let the grinding machinery of economic progress completely crush what made them human. The factory workers of industrial Manchester were heroes who never got parades. They were warriors who fought daily battles against cold, hunger, exhaustion, and exploitation, and they won, eventually, not for themselves, but for the generations that came after. Sleep well tonight. You've earned it just by being alive in an era when sleep is possible, when survival doesn't require sacrificing everything including your dignity, when tomorrow isn't guaranteed to be exactly as miserable as today. The factory workers who came before would probably be jealous of your heated blankets and your weekends and your ability to use a toilet in privacy. But they'd also probably be proud that their suffering meant something, that the world eventually, slowly, grudgingly, became a bit less cruel. Not because factory owners suddenly grew consciences, but because workers like them refused to accept that suffering was inevitable, necessary or acceptable. Good night, stay warm, and remember, your ancestors survived the coldest nights in history so you wouldn't have to.